I don't usually take time off. I work 6 days a week doing security at a trucking yard, 12-hour shifts mostly. The pay is decent, but it drains you. My only real escape is when I can get far away from the city, off the grid for a few days. So when my cousin offered me the keys to his old hunting cabin up in the northern part of the state, I said yes without thinking twice. He wasn't using it, and it had been empty for over a year. I figured I'd stock it with food, bring some tools, maybe clean it up a bit and have it ready for him next hunting season. I left early on a Thursday morning in mid-October. The trees were already golden and red, and the roads were nearly empty once I got past the highway. I had the whole weekend off, no wife or kids to call or check in with, and I didn't bring any electronics besides my phone and a backup battery pack. The place didn't even have cell service, so I expected peace and quiet. The drive took about 6 hours. The last part of the road turned into gravel and then narrowed into a dirt trail that looked like it hadn't been driven on in months. I drove my old Tacoma slow, trying not to bottom out on roots or potholes. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it felt like I'd arrived in a forgotten place. The cabin was small, built from old gray logs with a metal roof. There was a porch in front with a couple of rotting chairs and an old stump where someone had chopped firewood. No lights, no generator in sight, just an outhouse about 30 yards away and a metal barrel for burning trash. The nearest neighbor was probably 10 miles off, at least. It was dead silent. I unpacked what I'd brought. A cooler of food, 2 5-gallon jugs of water, a hunting knife, my camping stove, some firewood, my sleeping bag, and a few other supplies. I walked around the cabin to check for any damage. The back steps had rotted halfway through, and the window screens were all torn, but otherwise it looked all right. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There were some old canned goods in the kitchen shelves, a propane lamp, and a rusted-out wood stove. That first night was quiet. I boiled some instant noodles on my camp stove, read a book under the lantern light, then rolled out my sleeping bag near the window. Took me a while to fall asleep with how quiet it was. There was no hum of electricity, no traffic, not even the sound of bugs, just the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I stepped outside with my flashlight, shivering a little. The air was cold and sharp, and the sky was full of stars. I walked toward the outhouse, did my business, and started heading back. That's when I thought I heard something behind me, branches moving, like someone was stepping over them. I froze and pointed my flashlight toward the trees, but I didn't see anything. I stood still for a good minute, then shook it off and went back inside. The next morning, I explored the area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led down to a dried-up creek bed, and a couple of old deer stands nailed into trees. I didn't go far, just enough to stretch my legs. Around noon, I was back at the cabin chopping some firewood when I found something strange. There were boot prints in the soft dirt behind the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were deeper and wider. Not fresh, but not old either. I followed them for a bit. They went past the outhouse and veered off into the trees. Maybe a hunter had come by in the past week or so. But if that were true, why would they come so close to the cabin? And how did they even get here? There were no tire tracks on the road. I didn't think much of it at the time. People wander in the woods. Maybe someone was just scouting. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the place and chopping more wood. By nightfall, I had a small fire going in the stove, and I felt more relaxed. But that night, something changed. I was in my sleeping bag again, staring at the ceiling when I heard footsteps outside. Not animals' footsteps. Slow, careful, deliberate. They crunched leaves just once or twice, then stopped. I sat up and listened. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly stepped to the window, keeping the light off. I didn't see anything at first. Then I caught movement near the edge of the trees, about 20 yards away. Someone was standing there, not moving, just a shadow between the trees, barely lit by the moon. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a man, tall, wide shoulders. I kept watching. He didn't move. I waited maybe 10 minutes. Then the shadow stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I stayed up the rest of the night with my knife in my lap. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside as soon as it got light enough, checked the area around the cabin, but saw nothing. No footprints this time, no broken branches. I was starting to wonder if I imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after being so cut off from everything. But I didn't feel safe anymore. I decided I'd leave the next morning, just finish out the day and get some sleep. I had no way to call anyone, and I wasn't in any real danger yet, but something felt wrong. That afternoon, I double-checked all my gear, made sure the truck was still running okay, and packed most of my stuff back into the cab. I left only what I needed for the night: some food, my sleeping bag, and a bit of firewood. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me sit up. At some point, I drifted off, then woke up again to a scraping sound. It was close. I looked at the window and froze. There was a figure standing on the porch. I didn't move. The person was just standing there, looking through the window. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a hood or a hat and a broad frame. No flashlight, no sound. I stared at them for what felt like forever. Then they moved slowly, walking back down the steps and around the side of the cabin. I grabbed my knife and quietly slid the bolt on the door shut. I didn't sleep again after that. Just sat in the corner of the cabin until the sun came up. In the daylight, I checked everything again. The ground was dry, but I saw faint marks, like someone had stood in the same spot on the porch for a while. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, but the feeling that someone had been right there watching me made my skin crawl. I packed the rest of my gear, jumped in the truck, and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I just wanted out. But as I drove back down the dirt road, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh footprints in the soft earth along the road. Not mine. They followed the edge of the trail for a while, then veered into the woods. Someone had been walking, maybe even following the road I came in on. There were no tire tracks besides mine. I drove faster, didn't stop until I hit the main road. Once I got cell signal again, I pulled over and called my cousin. Told him everything. He didn't say much, just said he'd go check it out next time he was up there. A few weeks later, he called me back. Said he found signs that someone had been living in the woods near the cabin. Old food wrappers, some blankets, even a makeshift lean-to built from branches and a tarp. He didn't find the person, but it was clear someone had been staying nearby, possibly watching the cabin. I never went back. I still take trips sometimes, camping, hiking, but only to places where I'm not totally alone. I bring a satellite phone now, and I always let someone know exactly where I'm going. I learned that no matter how peaceful a place seems, you never really know who might be out there, watching, waiting, hiding in the trees. The scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the people who stay just out of sight. The ones who don't speak. The ones who don't run. The ones who just watch. I decided to take a break from everything. Work, city noise, the endless buzz of phones and screens. It all had been getting to me. I needed time away, somewhere far from people. So I booked a week-long stay in a small, remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was one of those off-grid places with no internet, no cell reception, and the nearest town over 40 miles away. The idea was simple: unplug, relax, maybe hike a little, and clear my head. The cabin itself looked decent in the pictures. It was small, single-story, with a wood stove for heat, a hand pump for water, and a propane-powered stove. The place sat by a lake with no name. It had its own dock, a small boat, and was surrounded by forest on all sides. The rental agency emailed me a warning about local bears and to always keep food sealed up tight. I brushed it off. I dealt with raccoons back home. How bad could it be? I arrived just before dusk on a Sunday evening. The gravel road leading in was rough, mostly washed out in places. My SUV managed it, though barely. When I got out of the vehicle, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind you get late at night in the city, but a real, full silence. No cars, no voices, not even the distant hum of electricity. Just the breeze through trees and the occasional call of a bird or squirrel. The cabin had a simple lockbox with a key. I let myself in and checked the place out. It smelled like dry wood and dust, a little musty but not too bad. One main room served as the living area, kitchen, and bedroom, with a small bathroom that led to a composting toilet. There was a couch, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a large stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I unpacked, lit a few candles, and warmed up a can of soup on the propane stove. After eating, I sat outside for a while, watching the dark slowly roll in over the lake. I didn't realize how used to noise I'd become until I found myself uneasy just sitting there in the stillness. My eyes kept drifting to the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out, even though I knew nobody would. I chalked it up to nerves. That first night was cold. The temperature dropped fast, and though I had the wood stove going, I wasn't used to managing it. I kept waking up either too cold or too hot. Each time I woke up, I listened carefully to the outside. Couldn't help it. I kept thinking I heard soft sounds in the woods, like movement, maybe the crunch of leaves. Probably animals, I told myself. The second day I took the boat out. The lake was like glass. I didn't catch anything, but just floating there felt good. I read for a while, then walked around the perimeter of the cabin property, trying to get familiar with the area. There was an old trail behind the cabin, faint and overgrown, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. That evening, I cooked some pasta and sat outside again as the sun went down. I noticed something odd. There were small disturbances in the dirt near the back steps. Small scrapes like something had dragged along the ground. I didn't remember them being there before. I crouched down and took a look. They weren't shoe prints, more like claw marks, maybe a raccoon or porcupine. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The third night was when things started to get strange. I had finally figured out how to keep the stove at the right temperature and was sleeping better. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sharp thud against the back of the cabin. Not a small noise. This was loud, like something had slammed into the wall. I froze in bed, heart hammering. I listened, barely breathing. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no sounds of retreat. Just silence. I waited a long time before getting up. I pulled on a coat and grabbed the flashlight, quietly stepping out the front door. I crept around to the back of the cabin, shining the light around. The trees looked the same, tall and still. The dirt near the back wall was disturbed again, this time more heavily. Whatever had hit the cabin left a dent in the wood paneling. The claw marks were deeper now, in sets of 4. The next day I tried to relax, told myself it was a bear, maybe even 2 fighting. I spent the morning inside, reading, making coffee, and trying not to overthink. But I kept glancing at the windows, at the tree line, expecting something to move. I didn't go hiking that day. That evening I double-checked all the doors and windows. I brought the axe from the shed inside and kept it next to the bed. I set a small pan of coins and spoons by the door to act as a noise trap, something I saw in a movie once. If anything tried to get in, I'd hear it. Sometime past midnight, I woke again. This time not from noise, but from cold. The fire had died down. As I got up to stoke it, I heard a soft crunch outside. Then another. It wasn't fast, but slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I grabbed the flashlight and stood by the window, heart pounding again. I didn't want to shine it outside, afraid of drawing attention. So I just listened. Then I heard it. The coins in the pan rattled softly. I held my breath, completely still. Then nothing. Silence. The next morning, the pan was tipped over. A few coins had rolled away, but the door was still locked. There were more claw marks by the back window, which was now smeared with something. It looked like mud, but darker, almost black. I checked every window and door again, this time jamming wedges of wood under the door frames to keep them from opening easily. The 5th day, I decided I needed to leave. It didn't feel like an animal anymore. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like whatever was coming around wasn't just wandering or curious. It was looking for a way in. I packed everything, got in the car, and tried to drive out, but the road was blocked. A tree had fallen across the trail. Not a massive tree, but big enough that I couldn't move it alone. I tried using the axe to cut through, but it would have taken hours. The tree didn't look like it fell naturally. The way it lay across the road, parallel to the slope, and the clean break in the trunk made it seem off. I started to feel like it had been placed there. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, stayed fully dressed, and sat by the window with the flashlight and axe. Hours passed like days. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was breathing, not from inside, from just outside the wall near the window. Slow, deep, raspy breathing. My stomach turned. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I thought maybe it would go away. It stayed there for what felt like forever. Then footsteps, moving toward the back. Then silence again. I waited until dawn, grabbed the axe, and went outside. I found more claw marks deeper than before. Whatever it was had dug into the walls like it was trying to peel them back. I circled the cabin, then the road, then went back to the tree. I spent the next 4 hours chopping at it. My hands blistered. My arms shook. I didn't stop. Eventually, I cleared enough to drive through. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I drove straight home and didn't talk to anyone for days. I never reported it. What would I say? I didn't even know what to call it. It wasn't a person. It didn't feel like an animal either. It felt like something in between, something that waited, something that watched. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not alone. Not far. And when I hear something outside at night, I stay awake. Because I know silence doesn't always mean nothing is there. And I never found out who or what left those claw marks. But I don't need to. I saw enough. And I'll never go back to that cabin again. I needed a break. That's how it all started. I was tired of the noise, the deadlines, the traffic, and the constant need to be reachable every minute of the day. So, I decided to book a week off work and head into the mountains. I found this old cabin listed online, tucked into a forest clearing up in the hills of northern Idaho. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell signal. That's what made it perfect. The photos showed a porch, a small wood stove inside, a basic kitchen, and a single bedroom. I didn't need more. I packed up everything I thought I'd need. Clothes for the week, a few paperbacks, a bunch of canned food, some fresh groceries in a cooler, and a toolbox just in case something needed fixing. I brought my small generator too, figuring I might want to charge my phone or use a light if it got too dark. The drive up took nearly 5 hours, and the last stretch was rough gravel that wound through dense trees. The kind of place where, if something went wrong, you were completely on your own. When I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place looked older than in the photos, with the wood on the porch faded and some moss growing around the bottom of the exterior walls. But it was peaceful, silent, not a single car, plane, or voice. Just whined through the trees and the occasional bird call. I unpacked, got the generator hooked up, and made a simple dinner: beans, toast, and a can of soup. I didn't bother trying to get a signal. I just wanted to relax. That first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind, then went inside and read by lantern light before crawling into bed. The mattress was thin, and the cabin creaked a bit as it cooled, but I was used to worse. I slept okay. The second day, I went for a short hike behind the cabin. There was no marked trail, but I followed the natural path of flattened grass and animal tracks. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or two in, then circled back. The forest was thick, full of towering pine trees and clusters of ferns. I kept an eye out for bears or anything else big, but all I saw were squirrels and a few deer that darted off as soon as they noticed me. I came back in the afternoon, made another easy dinner, and sat out again to enjoy the silence. I felt better already. On the third day, something felt different. I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. There was a strange stillness outside. No bird calls, no wind, just a heavy kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. I brushed it off as morning fog or some weather change. But as I walked outside with my coffee, I noticed something odd. There were boot prints in the dirt path near the front steps. Not mine. These were deeper, wider, and looked fresher than anything I'd left the day before. They went from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin and then back again. I hadn't heard anything during the night. I followed them for a short way into the woods but lost them quickly in the underbrush. Could have been a hunter, I told myself. Maybe someone passing through. But I didn't like the idea of anyone being that close without me knowing. I checked the cabin door. Locked, just like I left it. Nothing inside was missing or moved. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, listening for any sound. The forest was still too quiet. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, more like a scraping. Something dragging along the porch floorboards. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and waited. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I checked again. There were fresh marks along the porch. Long scrapes in the wood, like something heavy had been dragged. I started keeping my hunting knife on me, even inside. I kept the generator off most of the time now, not wanting to draw attention with the sound. I also kept the windows closed. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a bear sniffing around. But it didn't sit right. Bears don't wear boots. On the fourth day, I hiked back into the woods in a different direction, trying to get my mind off it. The air was colder that day. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't relax. I kept feeling watched. Every time I stopped walking, I thought I heard something just beyond the trees. I turned around early and came back. There were no new prints this time, no new marks, but I still didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found something that changed everything. Behind the cabin, near the back wall, someone had built a little pile of rocks. At first, I thought it was natural, but then I noticed a small piece of folded paper tucked under one of the rocks. It was wet from dew and hard to read, but someone had written on it in pencil. The writing was shaky, barely legible. It just said, "Leave now." I felt like I was going to throw up. I kept looking around the trees, waiting for someone to step out, but nothing happened. I grabbed my bag, stuffed it with essentials, and threw it in the truck. I debated leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to run. I checked my phone, still no signal. I had one more night before I planned to go back. I figured if nothing else happened, I'd just wait it out and go first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my knife, trying to stay awake. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again, the dragging, then a thud on the wall, then footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps stopped by the window. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Minutes passed. Then I heard retreating steps, the dragging again, then silence. I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly. Nothing was there, but something had been left on the porch. My cooler. It had been taken from the back of my truck and placed right in front of the door. The lid was off. Inside, everything was gone except the raw meat I'd brought. That was left, neatly wrapped in a plastic bag. I left immediately. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I drove down that gravel road faster than I should have, bouncing around turns and scraping the undercarriage more than once. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. When I told the clerk where I'd been staying, he just looked at me and said people don't usually rent that cabin more than once. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. I got back to the city and tried to forget it. I told myself it was just someone messing with me. Maybe a local who didn't like strangers. But the truth is, I don't know what it was. Whoever or whatever it was, they wanted me gone. And they made sure I listened. I haven't gone back to the woods since. It was supposed to be a quiet break. That was the plan when I booked the cabin. I had been living in the city for too long. Too much noise, too many people, too many long nights at the office. I felt like I was slowly losing my mind from all the pressure. The cabin I found was deep in the forest, about 5 hours north from where I lived. It was cheap, isolated, and had no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. The road there was narrow and cracked. The trees grew close to the gravel path, and for long stretches, it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of green. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I was already starting to feel better. It was a single-story wooden structure with a small porch, a tin roof, and old windows with wooden frames. The The forest surrounded it on all sides. No neighbors, no street lights, just trees and quiet. I parked my truck a few feet from the porch and stepped out. The air smelled different, cleaner. The only sounds were birds and the wind. I carried my bags inside. The place was basic. One bedroom, one small bathroom, a kitchen with old appliances, and a living room with a fireplace. No TV, no Wi-Fi. I unpacked slowly and took my time getting used to the silence. The first day passed quietly. I made dinner, read a book, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. It got cold quickly once the light disappeared, so I went inside and lit a fire in the old fireplace. I fell asleep on the couch with a blanket over me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up in the middle of the night. The second day, I decided to go for a short hike. There was an old trail behind the cabin, barely visible, overgrown in some parts. I followed it for about an hour before turning back. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I saw no deer, no squirrels, not even a bird once I was deep enough in. Still, I told myself it was just the time of day. Animals moved around at dawn and dusk, not mid-morning. That night, I started hearing things. It began with small sounds, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. At first, I assumed it was raccoons or maybe a bear. The cabin had a steel trash can with a lockable lid out back, so I wasn't too worried. I went outside with a flashlight, scanned the trees, and saw nothing, just shadows. On the third night, the sounds got louder, more deliberate, like footsteps, not heavy, not fast, just slow, careful steps moving through the underbrush. They circled the cabin once and then faded. I stayed frozen on the couch, ears straining. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found footprints, bare footprints in the mud behind the cabin, near the trail I had hiked the day before. They were human, not large, maybe a size 10, but they were definitely not mine. I had been wearing boots. These were from bare feet, deep, fresh prints. Whoever it was, they had walked around the back of the cabin and toward the woods. I started to feel uneasy. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking the windows and doors. All locked, nothing broken. I didn't see anyone around. I didn't hear anything, but the forest felt different, heavier. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like it was pressing in on me. That night, I moved a chair in front of the door and slept with a kitchen knife beside me. I kept the fire going just for the comfort of light. Sometime around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they came up to the porch. The boards creaked. I sat up, heart pounding, not moving. I didn't breathe. The steps stopped. Then I heard nothing, not for minutes. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sun came up, I opened the door and looked around. Nothing there. But on the ground, just at the bottom of the steps, were more bare footprints. One set. They had stood at the edge of the porch, watching. By the fifth day, I was no longer relaxed. I hadn't come out here to be paranoid. I came to get away. But now I kept checking the windows. I kept every light on after sunset. I didn't hike anymore. I didn't sit on the porch. I didn't sleep. I tried calling someone, but my phone still had no service. I tried driving into town, but the closest place was almost 2 hours away, and I didn't want to leave the cabin empty. If someone was stalking it, I didn't want to give them that window. On the sixth night, something changed. I was sitting in the living room, knife in hand, fire low. Around 2 a.m., I heard something at the window behind me. Not a sound, a shadow. A shape moved across the curtain. I jumped up and ran to the door, threw it open, and shined my flashlight around. Nothing. I walked around the whole cabin. Still nothing. But when I came back in, the curtain was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. I barely slept. My body was running on adrenaline and fear. I kept replaying everything in my head. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe the wind. But the prints were real. The noises were real. On the seventh day, I decided to pack up and leave early. I hadn't planned to go back for another 3 days, but I couldn't take the stress. I was more exhausted than when I arrived. I stuffed my clothes into my bag, loaded the truck, and took one last walk around the cabin. That's when I found the new footprints. They were on the porch, right in front of the door, fresh, still wet from the morning dew. They hadn't been there when I woke up. I had checked. I didn't wait. I got in the truck and started driving down the narrow road, heart racing. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I got to the first gas station with cell service, I called the sheriff's office in that county and reported it. They sent someone to check. A deputy called me back later and said the place was empty. No sign of anyone. But here's the thing. I had locked the door when I left. The deputy said it was wide open when he got there. Nothing taken, nothing broken, just the door wide open and muddy footprints inside. I never went back to that cabin. I canceled the rest of the booking. The owner didn't ask why. Maybe they knew something. Maybe it had happened before. Took me weeks to sleep normally again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that window, that shadow, those footprints. I never found out who it was. No one was ever caught. No one ever followed up. But I still think about it. About the silence in the woods. About how easy it is to disappear out there. And about how someone, barefoot and watching, had been so close to me night after night. Never saying a word, just watching. And I will never forget that feeling. That I was not alone, no matter how quiet it was. It was early November when I decided to take a break from everything and go up to the cabin my uncle left me in his will. It sat deep in the forest in northern Michigan, far away from the closest road. The area was cold, wet, and silent that time of year, but that suited me fine. I needed to be alone. Life had gotten too noisy, too messy. I packed only what I needed. Food for 10 days, water filters, a solar lantern, a sleeping bag, basic tools, and my old hunting rifle just in case. There was no cell service up there, and that was part of the appeal. The hike in took me the better part of the day. The trail hadn't been maintained in years, and the last hour of the walk I was pushing through damp undergrowth. When I reached the cabin, I was soaked with sweat under my jacket, even though the air was cold. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little. Moss had grown thick along the base. The door stuck, but I shouldered it open. Inside, everything was still there. Old wooden furniture, dusty shelves, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a faded rug that smelled like mildew. I set my pack down, opened a few windows to air it out, and started sweeping. It took most of that first day just to make the place feel usable again. I chopped a bit of wood before sunset and got a small fire going in the stove. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind and trees creaking outside. The next few days were quiet. I hiked around the area, collected dry wood, cleaned out the rusted tools in the shed behind the cabin. On the third day, I found an old trail leading west from behind the cabin. I didn't remember that from childhood visits. It was barely visible, mostly covered in fallen leaves and debris, but it looked like it had once been used often. Out of curiosity, I followed it for about 20 minutes before it started to curve downhill. The forest got denser. I turned back after that. Later that evening, I sat out on the small porch with my lantern. The air was colder than usual, and I kept feeling like something was watching from the woods. I told myself I was just not used to being so alone. I had my rifle nearby, loaded but uncocked. That night, I heard something outside. It sounded like someone walking slowly in the leaves. I froze in bed and listened. The steps circled around the cabin. I waited, barely breathing, until they stopped. I sat up quietly and reached for the rifle. I didn't turn on the light. The sound didn't come back. After maybe an hour of sitting still, I laid back down, but I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went outside and checked. There were tracks around the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were long and narrow and spaced far apart. They went around the entire structure and then off into the trees toward the trail I'd found. I followed them a little ways until they disappeared on the rocky slope. I tried to tell myself it could have been someone messing with me, maybe a local, but who would be barefoot in this cold, in the middle of the forest? It didn't make sense. I felt uneasy the whole day. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I stayed inside and sat near the stove with the fire low. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Steps. Slow, deliberate. This time, they stopped right at the front door. I didn't move. I just listened. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. I stood up, rifle in hand. The knob rattled again, more aggressively. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard steps moving around the cabin again, going toward the back. I went to the window beside the stove and peeked out. I saw something move between the trees. It was tall, maybe a head taller than me, and very thin. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. It was too dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I packed my things. I didn't care about staying the full 10 days anymore. I wanted out. I loaded my pack and opened the door. That's when I saw the small pile of rocks right in front of the steps. 7 of them stacked carefully. They hadn't been there the day before. I kicked them over and started walking. The hike back was harder. I felt like I was being followed. I kept hearing things behind me, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just woods. I made it to the car just before sunset. I sat inside with the doors locked for a few minutes before starting the engine. I drove away without looking back. A week later, I decided to tell my cousin about it. He was the only other person who knew about the cabin. He looked at me for a long time before nodding. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was taken 2 years ago. A similar stack of 7 stones, placed in the same spot, in front of the cabin steps. He said he'd gone up there for hunting and found the rocks. Then, the next night, someone or something had come up to the cabin and scratched the window glass with something sharp. He didn't stay the whole trip either. I haven't been back since. I keep telling myself it was probably some hermit living in the woods. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone with mental issues. That's the most rational explanation. But even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear slow steps outside my window. I haven't sold the cabin. I keep thinking I might go back one day, maybe with other people. But something inside me says I shouldn't. The place doesn't feel like it belongs to me. Maybe it never did. I needed to get away from the city for a while. Work had been draining, and everything felt like too much. The noise, the traffic, even the constant buzz of my phone. I couldn't think straight anymore. So I rented a cabin in northern Idaho, far away from everything. I booked it for 2 full weeks. I didn't want anything fancy, just a quiet place with no people around, where I could sleep, think, and maybe clear my head. The place I chose was isolated, really isolated. I had to drive 5 hours out of Boise and another hour down a winding forest road full of potholes just to get there. The trees were thick and tall on both sides, and my car barely fit between them at times. My cell signal dropped about 10 miles before the cabin, and by the time I pulled up the gravel driveway, I was completely cut off from the world. That's exactly what I wanted. The cabin itself looked simple. Small, maybe 30 feet by 30 feet, with a tin roof and a narrow porch out front. There was a shed behind it, locked up with a rusted padlock. I figured it held tools or something for the property, so I didn't think much of it at first. I parked my car next to the cabin, got my duffel bag from the back seat, and walked up to the porch. The key was under the mat, just like the owner told me it would be. I let myself in. Inside, it was about what I expected. 1 room for everything. Bed in the corner, a small table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a tiny kitchenette with a fridge and a sink. There was a bathroom in the back with a shower and toilet. No internet, no TV. It was exactly what I was looking for. That first day, I just unpacked and walked around the property a little. The trees went on forever. There was a trail off to the right of the cabin, but I didn't go far down it. I was tired from the drive, so I spent most of the evening reading a book and sipping tea by the stove. I went to bed early, just as the sun dropped behind the trees. That night was the first time I heard the sound. Came from behind the cabin. It wasn't loud, just a dull metallic clank, like something heavy shifting or bumping into metal. At first, I thought it was maybe an animal knocking something over. I didn't even get up, but the sound came again about 5 minutes later. Another clank, a scrape, then silence. I got out of bed, walked over to the window and looked outside. The trees were pitch black. I couldn't see anything. The only light was from the moon, and it wasn't enough to make anything out. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. Nothing. It was dead quiet. The next morning, I went behind the cabin to check it out. There was nothing unusual. The shed was still locked, the ground undisturbed. I figured maybe a deer or raccoon had bumped into something. I didn't think too hard about it. I made some coffee, sat on the porch, and let myself relax. The second night, I heard it again. Same time, sometime after midnight. Same sound, a heavy clank, followed by a scrape. This time, I got up and went outside with a flashlight. I walked around the back of the cabin and pointed the beam at the shed. Everything looked normal. The door was still locked. No signs of animals. But the sound hadn't come from the woods. Came from the shed. I was sure of it. I shook the padlock on the shed. It was secure. I pulled on the door. Nothing. I circled around it and checked the sides. It was made of old wooden planks with a tin roof. There were no windows. I even looked under it to see if maybe something had gotten inside that way. But there was no gap, no hole. I went back inside. That night, I didn't sleep as well. On the third day, I walked the trail. I needed to take my mind off things. The forest was beautiful, quiet, still. I didn't see anyone else the whole time. I followed the path for about an hour before turning back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The padlock on the shed looked newer, shinier, like it had been swapped out. I knelt down and looked closer. It wasn't the same lock. The old one had been rusted and worn. This one was clean, like it had just come out of a hardware store. My heart started to beat a little faster. I hadn't touched the lock. No one else was supposed to be out here. I went back inside and locked the cabin door. That evening, I sat by the window facing the shed and waited. I left the lights off so I could see better outside. For hours, nothing happened. But then, just before 1 a.m., I heard it again. The same metallic clank. Then a dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the floor. It was definitely coming from inside the shed. I grabbed the flashlight and went out again. I moved slowly, my hands sweaty, the cold air biting at my face. I walked right up to the shed and stood there, listening. Silence. Then I thought I heard breathing, very faint, slow, like someone was inside, holding their breath. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I checked the woods for tire tracks or footprints. Nothing. Just the old gravel path where my car had been parked. No sign that anyone had come or gone. I walked down the dirt road for half a mile, looking for anything. Footprints, wrappers, anything, but it was clean. No one had been out here but me. I was sure of it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside that shed. That evening, I searched the cabin for anything to use as a weapon. I found a rusty hatchet in a cabinet under the sink. I kept it next to my bed that night. At 12:45 a.m., the sound started again. Clank, scrape, clank. I didn't go outside this time. I just sat up in bed, frozen, listening to the sounds go on for almost 10 minutes. Then they stopped. I lay there with the hatchet clutched in my hand until the sun started to come up. The next morning, I finally decided to leave. I'd only been there 4 nights, but I couldn't take it anymore. Something wasn't right. I packed up my things and went out to the car. That's when I saw the footprints. Not animal prints. Human ones. Bare feet. Big ones. They started from the edge of the woods and went around the side of the cabin, stopping at the shed. Then they circled the cabin. They stopped right outside my bedroom window. Then they went back into the woods. I felt sick. I ran to my car and got in. It wouldn't start. The engine clicked, sputtered, then nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. I opened the hood and looked around, even though I knew nothing about engines. The battery cables were cut, clean, like with wire cutters. I ran back into the cabin and locked the door. I turned on the stove, hoping the sound would drown out the silence. I sat in the middle of the room with the hatchet in my lap, heart pounding, staring at the window. All day I waited. Nothing happened. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat there, the hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other, staring at the front door. Around 2:15 a.m., I heard the back door handle move. Just once. A single jiggle. Then silence. I stayed frozen until the sun came up. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to hike out. It would take hours, maybe most of the day, but I had no choice. My car was useless. I filled my backpack with water, snacks, and a few essentials. I left everything else behind. I started walking down the road, sticking to the gravel path. I walked for almost 2 hours before I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Not running, just walking, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them or not. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. Faster. My heart was in my throat. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I finally turned around. No one was there. The road was empty. I didn't stop moving until I reached the highway almost 5 hours later. I flagged down a truck, explained everything as quickly as I could, and got a ride to the nearest town. The cops went back to the cabin with me later that day. When we got there, the cabin was exactly as I left it, but the shed was wide open. The lock was gone. Inside, they found something that still gives me nightmares. A mattress on the floor, dirty blankets, empty food wrappers, dozens of soda cans, a bucket full of waste, a knife on the ground, and pinned to the back wall, pictures of me, taken from outside the cabin window, dozens of them, me sitting by the stove, me walking to the outhouse, me asleep in bed. The police said someone had been living in the shed, watching me, maybe for days, maybe longer. They never caught the guy. I didn't go back to the cabin. I never will. I think about it all the time. How close he was. How I almost opened that shed. How he stood outside my window. How he cut my battery cables. How I might have been just one more night away from never making it out of there. Now I live in a third-floor apartment. Deadbolt on the door. Curtains on every window. And I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't really talk about this much, and honestly, I haven't even thought about it in detail in a long time. But sometimes at night, when I'm lying in bed with the lights off and things get quiet, I think about that week I spent alone in the woods. It was just supposed to be a few days of repair work at my uncle's cabin. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic, just cleaning up after a storm, fixing up the driveway, and maybe sealing some cracked pipes. But the whole thing spiraled into something I wasn't ready for. It wasn't ghosts. It wasn't monsters or hallucinations. It was just fear, the kind that creeps in when you realize you're really, truly on your own, and something's not right. My uncle owns this cabin in a steep forested part of the mountains, about 3 hours away from the closest town. The place sits low on a slope, and there's only one way in or out. A winding dirt road that hugs the ridge and passes over a small wooden bridge. The land is quiet out there, real quiet. No cell signal, no nearby cabins, no traffic noise. You hear wind, birds, the occasional creak of the trees. A storm came through the region about a week before I drove up. Heavy rains caused a minor landslide above the cabin, which clogged the drainage ditches and blocked part of the road. My uncle was away on a long work trip overseas, and he asked me to check on the place and make some basic repairs. I had nothing pressing going on, and I figured a few days in the woods might even be relaxing. I loaded up my truck with some tools, fuel, food, and a couple of spare jugs of water. The drive up was fine until I hit the washed-out section of road. A chunk of hillside had slid down, covering about 30 feet of the narrow dirt path with rock, soil, and branches. I parked a bit before it and used a shovel and some boards to carve a path wide enough for the truck. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The wooden bridge near the cabin had taken some damage too. A few boards were cracked and loose. I made a mental note to deal with it before I left. It was still passable, just not something I wanted to cross too often. The cabin itself looked mostly fine. One of the side gutters had detached, and some of the pipes underneath were exposed. But the structure was still solid. The first night was quiet. I brought in my gear, locked the door, and settled into the small back room where the bed was. The cabin doesn't have power except for a small solar setup that powers a few lights and charges a small radio. There's a propane heater, a tiny kitchen, and a rainwater tank hooked up to a basic filtration system. It's rustic, but comfortable enough. I kept waking up that night, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. At home, I'm used to hearing distant traffic, dogs barking, people moving around in other rooms. Out there, it was silent. So silent I could hear the blood in my ears. The kind of silence that makes you think something's wrong. The next day, I started clearing more of the road and checked the uphill slope behind the cabin. The slide had come close to the structure but didn't hit it. Still, there was a lot of loose soil and roots up there. I didn't like how unstable it looked. If another storm came through, it could easily bring more down. I made a small ditch with a mattock to redirect water away from the rear of the cabin, just in case. Around mid-afternoon, while I was working near the base of the slope, I felt something weird. Just a sudden awareness that I wasn't alone. Not even anything visual or audible, just that tightening in your gut. I stood up, scanned the trees, didn't see anything, and told myself it was just nerves. But I stopped working after that. Back inside, I checked the food, cleaned the kitchen, and read for a bit. I left the door locked and moved a bench in front of it just for extra assurance. I didn't sleep great that night either, not because of noise. Again, it was just too quiet. But around 2 in the morning, I heard something, a very faint thud from outside. Not an animal, not wind. It was deliberate. I sat up in bed and didn't move for a long time. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet, a folding knife, and a crowbar. I kept the hatchet close. Eventually, I told myself it was probably a tree limb falling or something shifting outside. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept listening. And then I heard something again, a soft creak, like weight settling on wood. The porch. I stayed completely still. My mind started going through scenarios. Could be a deer, a bear, someone passing through. But none of that explained how slow and careful the sound was. I didn't hear footsteps, just pressure, shifting weight. I finally got up and went to the small window beside the door. I didn't turn on a light. I just looked. But it was pitch black outside. Nothing moved for the next hour. Eventually, the sounds stopped, or I stopped noticing them. The next morning, I checked the porch. No footprints, no scratch marks. The dirt was dry and hard, so I wouldn't have seen prints unless it had rained. But the top step had a fresh scuff, like it had been scraped by something hard. I tried to reason it away. Maybe I did it. Maybe it had always been there, but I hadn't noticed it before. I kept working that day but stayed close to the cabin. I fixed up the water lines and did a basic inspection of the roof. I ate early and locked everything up by sunset. I made sure the propane tanks were secure and stacked some firewood by the door. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m. It wasn't sound that woke me. It was cold, ice cold. The heater had stopped. I went to check it and saw that the propane line had been shut off. The valve was twisted tightly shut. I hadn't touched it since setting it up. I opened the cabinet and stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Someone had been inside, or at least on the porch, messing with the valves. I grabbed the hatchet and flashlight and checked every inch of the cabin. The windows were locked. The door was locked, but still something had changed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I just sat in the corner with my back to the wall, facing the door, listening. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. About 30 feet behind the place, in a patch of dry moss, I found something that nearly made me throw up. A small pile of bones. Rabbit bones, maybe, clean, arranged in a neat circle. Right in the middle was a rock with a dark red smear on it. It wasn't just nature. It was placed that way, on purpose. I packed my stuff fast. I wasn't waiting to see what came next. I shoved everything into the truck and drove back up the dirt path toward the wooden bridge. When I got to it, I slammed the brakes. The bridge was broken. The 2 main boards that supported the tires had been sawed through. Not all the way, just enough that pressure would snap them. I stepped out and looked closely. It wasn't erosion. It wasn't rot. The cuts were clean, deliberate. Someone had tried to trap me there. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing, thinking. Then I went to the back of the truck, grabbed a beam and some nails, and tried to brace the damaged boards. I tested them with my weight, slowly. I groaned but held. When I finally drove across, I held my breath the whole way. Every creak made my heart feel like it was about to rip through my chest. But I made it. I didn't stop until I was an hour down the mountain, back on the highway with cell signal. I pulled over and called my uncle, told him everything. He didn't say much. Later, he emailed me that he'd hired someone to check the place and found more strange things. Scratches on the trees around the property, animal bones hanging from branches. He sold the place a month later. I never figured out who it was. Maybe just some guy living rough in the woods, maybe more than one person. But it wasn't supernatural. It was real. It was human. And it scared me in a way nothing else has since. Now when I go camping, I take extra fuel, a weapon, and I always make sure I can leave whenever I want. Because being stuck in the woods isn't scary because of bears or ghosts. It's scary because of the kind of people who wait until you're all alone, out of reach, and no one knows you're there. And the worst part? You might never even see them. I was 37 when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin in the northern woods of Michigan. Life in the city had been draining me. Between the noise, work deadlines, and the growing pressure from people around me, I felt like I was coming apart. I needed to breathe, to sit in silence, and let my head clear. I found an old rental listing for a cabin about 3 miles off a dirt road near Lake Superior, far from any nearby towns. The pictures looked old, like they hadn't been updated in years, but the place seemed decent. It had 4 walls, a roof, a fireplace, and most importantly, no cell signal. I arrived in the early afternoon. The cabin looked even older in person, surrounded by thick pine trees and barely their trails. The driveway was just a patch of dirt, barely wide enough for my SUV. The air was cold and smelled like pine needles and wet earth. A few birds chirped in the distance. It was peaceful. I grabbed my bags, walked inside, and was greeted with musty air, like the place hadn't been opened in years. Dust covered every surface. A large fireplace took up most of the far wall. There was an old couch facing it, a small kitchen to the left, and a hallway that led to the bedroom and bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but I hadn't come for luxury. I come for silence. I spent that first day airing the place out and unpacking. I cleaned the kitchen counters, wiped down the old wooden table, and opened the windows even though the air outside was freezing. The quiet was perfect. No honking, no construction noise, no shouting. Just wind and trees. I made a simple dinner from the groceries I'd packed and sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. It got dark quickly, the kind of darkness you don't get in the city. No streetlights, no glow from nearby buildings, just pure black. I brought my flashlight inside and locked the front door. There was an old bolt at the top and a chain. I used both. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I could hear every small sound, branches cracking, animals moving through the underbrush, wind creaking through the trees. I kept telling myself it was just nature doing its thing. I stayed under the covers, flashlight beside me, and eventually drifted off around 3 a.m. The next morning, I woke to the sound of tapping. It was light, rhythmic, like someone drumming fingers on wood. I sat up and listened. It was coming from the front of the cabin. I got out of bed, pulled on a sweatshirt, and slowly walked toward the door. The tapping stopped. I peeked out the small window beside the door. Nothing, just trees and dirt. I figured it was a bird or some squirrel playing games and went back to the kitchen to make coffee. The second day was calm. I read most of the day, sitting near the fireplace with a blanket wrapped around me. I didn't light a fire yet. It wasn't that cold. Around 4 p.m., I decided to hike around a bit. There were no clear trails, but I had a decent sense of direction. I marked a few trees with pieces of orange string just in case I got turned around. The woods were thick, full of fallen logs and soft moss, and incredibly quiet. No people, no planes overhead. I made it maybe a half-mile out and turned back. On my way back, I found something strange near a tree. A boot print, not mine, larger than my foot, deep in the mud and recent. It hadn't rained since I'd arrived. which meant it had to be fresh. I stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Could someone else be out here? A hunter, maybe? But I hadn't heard a single gunshot or engine. Just birds and wind. I walked back faster than I'd gone out. Once inside the cabin, I locked the door and shut the windows. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an old print that hadn't dried yet. Still, I kept the flashlight closer that night. On the third morning, I woke to more tapping. This time it was louder. I got up and moved to the front window again. Still nothing. No tracks, no people, no signs of animals. The tapping had stopped again the moment I approached the window. It was starting to get under my skin. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for loose branches or anything that could be causing the noise. I didn't see anything suspicious, just trees and the same empty woods. That evening, I made a fire. The temperature had dropped, and I didn't want to sit around in silence with my nerves chewing at me. The flames gave the cabin a little life. I sat with a book, though I wasn't really reading. I was listening again. Every little sound seemed louder. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the dirt just outside the wall. Slow, spaced out, like someone walking carefully. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped. I turned off the lamp and stood quietly in the dark, listening. Minutes passed, maybe more. Nothing else happened. I waited another hour before turning the light back on. By the fourth day, I was on edge. I wasn't enjoying the silence anymore. It felt like the woods were watching me. I started keeping my pocket knife clipped to my jeans at all times, and I left a large kitchen knife on the nightstand. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard any voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I checked the boot print again. It was still there, still alone. No other prints. That bothered me the most. If someone was out here, how could they move without leaving more tracks? That night, I heard the tapping again. This time it came from the back wall, near the bedroom window. It was slow. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't go to the window. I just lay in bed, breathing shallow, staring at the ceiling. After 5 minutes, it stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The fifth day was worse. I woke up to find the front door unlocked. I always bolted it. Always. My stomach dropped when I saw it. I checked the chain, it was still on, which didn't make sense. You couldn't lock the chain from the outside. I searched the whole cabin. Nothing stolen. Nothing moved. But I couldn't ignore that someone had messed with the door. I packed my things that morning. I still had 2 nights left, but I was done. I needed out. I loaded my bags into the car, but when I turned the key, the engine clicked once and died. Battery was fine. Gas was half full. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. I'm not a mechanic, but even I could see someone had pulled out a few things. Wires were yanked. A hose was sliced. It wasn't wear and tear. It was sabotage. My heart was pounding. I stepped back and scanned the tree line. I didn't see anyone. I grabbed my largest flashlight, the kitchen knife, and the bear spray I'd packed. I considered walking the 3 miles back to the main road, but I didn't know what was waiting for me out there. I didn't trust the woods anymore. I stayed in the cabin that night with all the lights on. I moved the couch in front of the door, nailed the bedroom window shut with some old nails I found in the drawer. I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the front door. At 3:13 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animals, human, slow and dragging. They circled the cabin once. Then silence. No knock, no tapping, just quiet. I stayed frozen for hours until daylight broke. The 6th morning, I left. I didn't care what was in the woods. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed some food and water in it, and started walking the road. It was cold, and I could feel someone watching me the whole time, but I didn't stop. After nearly 2 hours of walking, I reached a small hunting shack near the road. No one was inside, but it had a working radio. I called for help and waited. An old man in a truck picked me up a couple hours later. I didn't explain much, just said my car broke down and I needed a tow. He brought me to a small garage in town. They sent someone out to get the SUV. When the mechanic returned, he confirmed what I already knew. Someone had messed with it. He asked if I had enemies. I didn't answer. I drove home that night after the repairs. I never went back for the rest of my stuff. The rental owner texted me a week later, asking why I left early. I didn't respond. I didn't even check the message beyond the preview. That cabin is probably still out there, still standing in the middle of those woods, waiting for the next person to show up looking for peace and silence. But I don't think peace lives in places like that anymore. I drove up into the mountains on a Thursday morning in early October. I had taken a few days off work to disconnect, clear my head, and just be somewhere quiet. I'd rented a small cabin online. Nothing fancy, just a one-room place with a kitchenette, a bed, a wood stove, and a bathroom. It sat about 4 miles from the nearest road, deep in a wooded part of northern Idaho. The website said it was a good place for riding or hiking or just sitting around doing nothing. That sounded perfect to me. The drive up was smooth, and the weather was still holding onto the last bits of warmth before the deep cold settled in. The trees had started changing, leaves all orange and red, falling across the narrow dirt road that led up to the place. I parked my SUV near a rusted metal gate, pulled my bag and a box of food from the back, and walked the short gravel path up to the cabin. There were no other buildings in sight, just woods. No phone signal either. I liked that. Inside the cabin, everything looked just like the pictures. Wood panel walls, a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner with a thick wool blanket, and a simple kitchen setup, small sink, electric stove, and an old mini fridge. There was a rack of firewood next to the stove and a stack of matches in a ceramic bowl. A few spider webs clung to the high corners, but it felt clean enough. Smelled like old wood and dry dust. I dropped my stuff by the bed and sat down for a while, just listening. No traffic, no voices, just wind in the trees and the faint sound of birds. That first night was quiet. I made some pasta on the stove, had a beer, and read a paperback thriller I brought. I didn't bother lighting the wood stove because the cabin held the day's heat pretty well. I fell asleep early, but something woke me up before dawn. A short, sharp knock on the outside wall. Not the door, just the wall near my head. I sat up, heart kicking a little. I waited, barely breathing. Then nothing, just stillness. I figured maybe a branch had fallen. I lay back down. The next day, I hiked around for a bit. There was a faint trail behind the cabin that led up to a ridge, and from there I could see for miles. I brought a small pack with some water, a sandwich, and a map I printed at home. There were no signs of other hikers. No boot prints, no trash. It felt like I was the only one around for miles. I stayed up on the ridge for a few hours, then made my way back down before it got dark. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something weird. The match bowl was on the floor. It had been on the shelf next to the wood stove. I didn't remember knocking it over, and the cabin had been locked. I stood there staring at it for a long minute. Then I told myself it probably slipped off when I shut the door earlier or something. I didn't sleep that well that night. I kept thinking about the noise from the night before and the match bowl. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard something outside again. This time a low crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I held still and listened. A minute passed, then another. Nothing else. But I kept the light on after that. By the 3rd day, I felt a little on edge. Not scared, really just unsettled, like I was being watched. I kept checking the windows without knowing why. Every time I walked out to the outhouse behind the cabin, I'd turn around halfway just to look behind me. It was always empty, just trees. I tried writing in a notebook I brought with me, but my thoughts kept drifting. I kept replaying the noise I heard, the way the match bowl had been knocked over. It didn't feel like much, but it was enough to mess with my head. I went on another hike that afternoon, this time along a dry creek bed. I found some old animal bones, maybe a deer, clean and white. Something had picked them dry. That evening, I decided to light the wood stove. The temperature had dropped, and I figured the warm glow would feel comforting. I lit it, fed it a few logs, and sat by it for a long time, just watching the flames. Around 11, I went to bed. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but eventually I did. And then I woke up, not to a sound this time, but to cold air. Real cold. I looked over and saw the fire had died. No big deal. But when I sat up, I realized the front door was open, just wide open. I froze. The latch was still in place, no signs of damage, but the door stood open by maybe a foot. I walked over, shut it slowly, and slid the bolt across. Then I stood there listening again. Nothing, just my own breathing. I checked the windows, all shut. I checked my pack and gear, nothing missing. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up in the chair by the stove with the flashlight in my lap. In the morning, I made a decision. I was going to leave. I packed everything up fast. As I loaded my bag, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A long scratch along the inside of the door. Not deep, but clearly not from normal wear. Like something had been dragged against it. I didn't know what to make of that. I started walking down the gravel trail back to where my car was parked. I didn't run, but I moved fast. The woods felt different now, less calm. I kept hearing small sounds, twigs breaking, leaves rustling. But every time I turned, it was just empty trees. When I got back to the car, I felt this huge relief. I tossed my stuff in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. The engine started fine. I pulled out fast, bouncing over the uneven road until I hit pavement. I drove to a small gas station about 30 minutes away and sat there for a while. I didn't go in. I just sat in the car with the windows up, heart finally starting to slow. I kept trying to explain everything to myself. Maybe someone had found the cabin and messed with me. Maybe a local, maybe a hunter, or a random drifter. That seemed possible. But that didn't explain how they got in without breaking the lock. That night, I booked a hotel room in a nearby town. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the open door, the long scratch, the footsteps. I wanted to forget it, but I couldn't. Weeks passed, then months. I went back to work. Life moved on, but I never really stopped thinking about that place. I looked up the rental site a few times, but the listing was gone. Out of curiosity, I searched the area on a map and found a blog by some amateur hikers. One post caught my eye. They mentioned stumbling across an old cabin deep in the woods, a place that looked abandoned but had signs someone had stayed there. They mentioned finding a rusted gate, a broken match bowl, and scratches on the inside of the door. That blog post was dated 3 years before my trip. After that, I stopped looking. I didn't contact the owner. I didn't report anything. I just let it go. But I still think about it, about how it felt to stand there in the dark, listening, wondering if someone or something was just outside the walls, watching, waiting, knowing I was alone and far from help. I haven't been back to the mountains since, and I never will. It was the middle of September when I decided to take a short break from everything. Work had been rough for months, and I was tired of the city noise, the traffic, and the way every day felt exactly the same. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. So I booked a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was far from any main road, and the listing said it had no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, and no neighbors within at least a mile in any direction. That was exactly what I needed. The drive out there took me almost 8 hours. The last hour of the drive was on a rough dirt road that twisted through tall pine trees and climbed slowly uphill. My car bounced and rattled over loose rocks, and at some points I had to crawl at 5 miles an hour just to avoid getting stuck. By the time I finally pulled up to the small wooden cabin tucked beneath the trees, the sun was low in the sky and I was exhausted. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a front porch with a chair, a little kitchen with a propane stove, and a small wood stove for heat. There was no running water, just a big blue barrel to catch rain and a bucket for filtering. The toilet was an outhouse about 20 yards into the woods. No electricity, just a couple of solar-powered lights and a rechargeable lantern. It was simple, quiet, and surrounded by thick forest in every direction. The first day and night were peaceful. I unpacked, cooked some canned soup on the stove, and sat on the porch watching the last light fade through the trees. The silence was deep and calming. I hadn't heard this kind of quiet in years. No cars, no phones, just the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. The next morning I got up early, stretched out my sore back, and decided to explore the area a bit. There wasn't a marked trail, but the forest was open enough that I could walk without too much trouble. I followed a gentle slope down behind the cabin, weaving between tall pines and over patches of moss and fallen branches. About an hour in, I found a small creek. The water was clear and cold. I sat on a rock and watched it for a while before heading back. I spent the next 2 days reading, walking, and chopping some wood for the stove. It felt good to disconnect, and the quiet was starting to feel normal. I started to fall asleep earlier, and my dreams were calm. I didn't even miss my phone, but things started to feel different on the fourth night. It started with a sound. I had just climbed into bed, tucked under thick blankets, and the fire in the stove was burning low. I was almost asleep when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal sound, not like a raccoon or a coyote. It was more like something heavy moving through the woods. Slow, steady crunching footsteps. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened. The sound stopped. I waited a few minutes, but there was nothing else. I told myself it was probably a deer and went back to sleep. The next morning I went out to look around, but I didn't see anything. No tracks, no broken branches. Still, the feeling stuck with me. The woods suddenly felt less friendly. I kept looking over my shoulder whenever I walked outside. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. I lay in bed, holding my breath, listening to the slow crunch of leaves moving around the building. Once, the steps stopped right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the ceiling until they finally moved away. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the porch, just beside the chair, was a long scratch in the wood, like something had dragged a sharp rock or a knife across it. It hadn't been there before. I checked the area, looked for footprints or any signs, but the ground was mostly dry pine needles. Nothing clear. I was starting to feel trapped. I had come here for peace, but now I was alone in the woods, miles from anyone, with no phone and no way to call for help. I told myself again it was probably an animal, maybe a bear, maybe it had brushed up against the cabin. But the footsteps had sounded too regular, too human. I decided I would leave the next morning. I had enough. I packed most of my stuff and kept a flashlight and hatchet by the bed. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up in the dark, waiting. The footsteps came back around midnight, slow and steady like before. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The steps moved around the cabin again, pausing at each window. I could barely hear them breathing. Not fast, not panting. Just a slow, steady breath. Then came a soft knock. Just once. On the back wall of the cabin. I sat frozen. I didn't move. My hands gripped the hatchet so hard my knuckles hurt. Another knock came, lower this time. Then silence. I waited for hours, but the sounds didn't come back. The first light, I got out. I didn't even bother to make coffee or eat. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and got in the car. The forest felt too quiet as I drove back down the dirt road. My tires slid a bit on the loose gravel, but I didn't stop. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again. I got home late that night. The city lights never looked so good. I turned my phone back on and saw dozens of messages from coworkers, friends, and a couple from my sister asking how the trip was going. I didn't reply to any of them. I just sat in the dark apartment, listening to the sound of traffic out the window. A week passed, then two. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't go back to work. I just sat at home, trying to forget. But one night, I checked the weather for that area out of curiosity. I zoomed in on the satellite map. There was the cabin, tucked deep in the woods. And just behind it, in the clearing I hadn't explored, was something I hadn't seen on the listing photos. A second structure. Not a cabin, not a shed, just a dark square, half covered by trees, with a narrow trail leading straight from the cabin's back wall to its door. I never reported it. I never told anyone. I just deleted the bookmark and tried to move on. But some nights, I still hear footsteps outside my apartment window, and they never knock. They just wait. I don't usually go away alone. I've always preferred being around people. Not in a loud or social kind of way, I just like the quiet comfort of knowing someone else is nearby, breathing in the same air, doing their own thing. But a few years ago, in the middle of one of those heavy, messy seasons of life where everything just feels like too much, I decided to get away. I rented a small off-grid cabin in the woods up north, far from any towns, any neighbors or noise. No cell service, no internet, just me and the trees. The place had no road leading directly to it. You had to park your car in a gravel clearing about a quarter-mile from the cabin and carry your stuff down a narrow dirt path. That was part of the reason I chose it. The listing made it sound so peaceful and quiet, like it had been untouched for years. It looked like something out of a magazine. Small but sturdy, a front porch with a swing, surrounded by thick woods in every direction. The cabin was tucked so far into the trees that even at midday, not much sunlight made it through the canopy. The inside was simple: one room, a wood stove for heat, a small cot, a little table and chair, and a few shelves stocked with essentials. There was a rainwater tank out back for washing up, a composting toilet in a shed about 20 feet away, and a generator I could use if I wanted light after dark. It smelled like cedar and old smoke and something damp in the corners. Still, it felt solid, safe even. I liked it more than I thought I would. That first day, I unpacked slowly. I kept checking the quiet. It was too quiet at times. No cars, no voices, not even planes overhead. Just the breeze in the trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I told myself I'd adjust. That was the whole point of the trip, to get quiet enough to think again. The first night, I stayed up late, reading by lantern light and sipping hot tea. I had the small window next to the cot cracked open to let in some air. I remember lying back, listening to the wind move through the trees, and thinking I might actually sleep well for the first time in months. I didn't. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. I sat up and listened. The cabin was quiet. No wind now, not even a creak from the old wood walls. Just stillness. Then I heard it. Leaves crunching. It was slow, like someone was walking outside the cabin. Not running, not moving quickly, just walking, stepping over fallen branches, brushing against bushes. I held my breath. The footsteps weren't coming from the path behind the cabin where I'd come in. They were off to the side, deeper into the woods. I sat up slowly and leaned toward the window. Couldn't see much, just black trees, darker sky, and the faint outline of the forest floor. The crunching stopped. I waited, ears straining. Then nothing. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe a bear. I wasn't used to the sounds of the woods. I probably overreacted. Still, I closed the window. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No prints, no scratches, no broken branches. I told myself it had just been my imagination. I had been tense for months. My brain probably wasn't ready to relax yet. I spent the day trying to settle in. Reading, writing, taking short walks down the path that led away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. I followed the trail for about half an hour before turning back. I didn't want to get lost. I didn't see or hear anyone the whole time. That night, I lit a small fire in the fire pit outside and sat on the porch swing. The sky above the trees was so full of stars it looked fake. It made me feel small in a way I didn't hate, just a tiny piece of something bigger. For the first time in a long while, I felt okay. Then I heard it again, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. This time, it was behind me, somewhere past the clearing that surrounded the cabin. I froze, stopped again like it had the night before. I stared into the trees, barely breathing. Nothing moved. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside. I locked the door. I double-checked it. I pushed the cot against it just in case. It made no real difference, but it helped me feel better. I slept with the lantern on. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, reading, writing, listening. Every sound made me flinch. Every gust of wind, every creak of the wood. That night, it happened again. But this time, the crunching didn't stop. It circled the cabin. Slow, steady steps moving through the brush, cracking small twigs. It moved from one side to the next, pausing near the back of the cabin, then continuing on. I sat up in the cot, staring at the door, my hands clenched in the blanket. It circled twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. I didn't want to, but I needed to see. This time, there were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. They weren't clear enough to count toes, but the shape was obvious. The dirt was soft from recent rain, and there were at least a dozen prints, some overlapping. They came from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the back wall. Then they turned and disappeared back into the trees. No path, no trail, just thick, uneven forest. I felt sick. I thought about leaving right then, but I was 2 days into a 7-day stay. I had enough food, enough water, enough supplies. The rental agreement said no refunds for early departure. I told myself it was a fluke. Some strange hiker, maybe a one-time thing. Maybe they didn't know I was there. Maybe they were just passing through. But I didn't believe it. I stayed inside all day. I didn't open the door, didn't open the windows. I didn't cook. I ate protein bars and cold canned soup. I barely moved. The night came faster than I expected. The sun sank behind the trees, and the darkness wrapped around the cabin like a thick blanket. I kept the lantern off to conserve fuel. I sat in the cot, listening. Just after midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they were heavier, slower, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. They stopped by the front porch. I sat frozen, staring at the door. I could hear them breathing, a low, steady sound, just on the other side of the wood. They stood there for at least a full minute. Then they tried the handle. I nearly screamed. I clapped both hands over my mouth to stop myself. The doorknob rattled softly, then again, then stopped. A long pause. Then the footsteps circled the cabin again. I stayed awake until dawn. I didn't move. I didn't even blink for long. Every time I thought they'd left, a twig would snap or a foot would brush against the ground. When the sun rose, I packed everything. I shoved my clothes, my gear, my notebooks into my backpack. I didn't care what I left behind. I just wanted to get out. I waited until full daylight. Then I opened the door and stepped outside. There were more footprints, so many more, all around the cabin. Deep, uneven prints in the dirt and dead leaves. Some close within feet of the door, others near the window where I had slept. I didn't wait to count them. I grabbed my pack, locked the door out of habit, and ran down the path. The air was cold and damp. Every shadow looked like someone waiting. Every sound felt aimed at me. Halfway to the car, I stopped. There were more prints on the trail, fresh ones, bare feet, leading both toward and away from the cabin. And then, in the soft dirt near a fallen log, I saw something that made my legs go weak. A piece of fabric. It was mine. A torn strip from a shirt I had packed but hadn't worn yet. It had been in my bag. I didn't stop again. I ran the rest of the way to the car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest town an hour and a half away. I parked in front of a gas station and just sat there, shaking. I didn't report it. What would I say? That someone walked around the woods barefoot at night? That they stared at my cabin and tried the door? It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even provable. I had no photos, no footage, no face to give them. I just never went back. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I don't stay in off-grid places. I don't trust the quiet, because I know what it sounds like now when someone walks slowly through the dark with no flashlight, no shoes, and no reason. And I know that not everyone who's out there wants to be seen. It started when I decided to spend a week alone at a small off-grid cabin that my cousin had inherited from our grandfather. The place sat about 30 miles deep into the forest in northern Montana, far from any towns or cell service. It wasn't meant to be a vacation. I just needed space, mental space, really. Work had been too much. I was coming off a breakup, and I was losing sleep every night. I thought the silence out there would reset me. Maybe I could breathe again. The cabin itself was more like a one-room wooden box with a front porch. No electricity, no plumbing, and the only water came from a nearby creek. There was an old outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin in a patch of thick pine. Inside was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wood stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rusted propane lantern hanging from the rafters. Everything smelled like dust, old wood, and burnt firewood. It looked like no one had lived there in years, but it wasn't in bad shape, just forgotten. I brought a cooler full of dry food, some water, firewood, a few books, and an old battery-powered radio. I had a Ruger 10-22 rifle with me, not for anything crazy, just for protection in case of bears or anything that might wander too close. I didn't plan on hunting or anything like that. The first day was quiet. I unpacked, walked down to the creek, and cut some dry kindling from fallen branches. I lit a fire in the wood stove just to test it. The chimney worked fine. That night, I cooked some canned chili and ate it on the porch while watching the sun dip behind the tall trees. I could hear nothing except for the wind and a few birds that were still up. It was the quietest place I had ever been. I slept deeply that night. The cold didn't bother me much because the fire had warmed the place enough. But around dawn, I woke up to the sound of something walking outside. Not running, walking, one step at a time. I sat up and waited. Could have been a deer, or maybe just the trees groaning in the wind. But it sounded too precise, like boots. But then nothing happened. The sound stopped. I waited for a while, heart beating in my ears, but I never heard anything else. I eventually convinced myself I had dreamed it or misheard something, and I fell back asleep. The next day, I explored further out. I followed the creek upstream, just walking and looking around. The forest was dense but calm. No signs of other people. No old campsites. No trash. I started to relax a bit more. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading and carving some small sticks into fire starters. That night, it rained. Light at first, then heavy. I stayed up inside, listening to the tin roof echoing the drops. Sometime around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps again. This time they were closer, right outside the front wall. I held my breath. It sounded like someone stepping through wet leaves, slow and careful. I grabbed the rifle and just sat there in the dark. The lantern was off. I didn't want to make noise. I waited a long time, maybe 20 minutes, until it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. Nothing. No footprints, though the ground was soaked and messy. I should have seen something, but it was clean. That bothered me more than if I'd found prints. If it had been an animal, I would have expected tracks. If it had been a person, they would have left something behind. The next night, I didn't sleep much either. I sat up in the chair with the rifle on my lap. I didn't hear anything for hours. I started to feel silly for being paranoid. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe I needed to leave. But by morning, I felt more angry than scared. I didn't want to let fear push me out. I told myself I'd stay at least 2 more days. That afternoon, I walked further out past the creek, into a rocky patch that slowly climbed uphill. There, I saw something that didn't belong. About 50 yards away, partially hidden by some trees, was a tent. An old green canvas tent. It looked sun-faded and lopsided. I stood there, staring at it for a long time. I didn't see anyone. I called out. Nothing. I got closer slowly, watching for movement. The tent flap was half open. Inside were a rolled-up sleeping bag, a few torn plastic bags, and some cans. All of it looked untouched for a while, maybe weeks. But the strangest part was that there were no shoes, no backpack, no signs of fire or anything that showed someone was still there. Just a camp that looked like it had been left in a hurry. I didn't touch anything. I just walked back to the cabin quickly. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Someone had been out here recently, and they had left everything behind. That night, I stacked wood against the door. I didn't think it would stop anyone, but it made me feel a little better. At around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was faster, heavier. Someone ran across the porch. I jumped up and grabbed the rifle. The sound stopped instantly. I waited. I thought maybe they were crouching just below the window. I didn't move. My heart was racing. I pointed the rifle toward the door and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing else happened. At sunrise, I went out to check. This time I saw prints. Not boots, bare feet, human. I followed them around the side of the cabin until they disappeared into the thick trees. The tracks were deep and wide apart, like whoever it was had been running hard. The mud around the prints had fresh water pooled inside them. It had rained just after they were made. I packed that morning. I didn't care about proving anything anymore. I just wanted to get out. I strapped everything back into my pack and left a note inside the cabin saying I was leaving early. I planned to follow the creek back toward the logging road where my cousin had dropped me off. About 2 miles out, I started to feel like I was being watched. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't just a feeling. I'd stop walking and listen. The forest would go dead silent. Then I'd hear something behind me, branches moving, a quick step. But when I turned, there was nothing. I kept going. Around noon, I reached the old logging road. It was a dirt path barely wide enough for a truck. I followed it, hoping I'd run into someone heading to town. But the whole day passed and I didn't see a single soul. No animals, no cars, nothing. I made camp that night about 20 feet off the road in a dense patch of trees. I didn't build a fire. I just lay in my sleeping bag with the rifle next to me, eyes wide open. I heard movement again, footsteps far off, but they circled closer, then further, like someone walking the perimeter. I didn't sleep. By the next day, I was running low on water. I hadn't eaten much. My head hurt from lack of sleep, but I kept walking. I figured another 10 miles and I'd reach the service station near the highway. That evening, just before dark, I saw smoke ahead, a small campfire. I slowed down, heart racing. As I got closer, I saw a man sitting next to the fire, legs crossed, head down. He wasn't moving. I stopped about 20 feet away. He was barefoot. His clothes were torn. His skin looked scraped and dirty like he had been out there for weeks. He didn't say a word, didn't look up. I backed away and walked into the woods, taking the long way around him. I didn't want to get any closer. Something was wrong with him. Something wasn't right. I didn't sleep that night either. I finally made it to the gas station around noon the next day. I must have looked like hell because the clerk called someone immediately. A sheriff showed up, and I told him everything. He took notes and nodded but didn't say much. When I mentioned the man near the fire, his eyes narrowed a bit. He said there were rumors about people squatting out in the woods, disappearing off the grid. Some of them weren't right in the head. They'd been known to follow hikers, sometimes even harass them. They drove me back to town. I didn't go back for my cousin's gear. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I never went back, and I never will. I heard later that someone did go up to check the tent I found. It was gone. No signs it had ever been there. No tracks, no footprints, just a bare patch of dirt. I don't know who or what that man was doing out there, but I'm done with cabins, done with the woods. Some people go out there and never come back. I was lucky. I got out. I don't usually tell people about this trip. It happened back in the fall of 2020, during a time when I felt like I needed to get away from everything for a while. The stress of work, the endless noise of the city, and a recent breakup had left me drained. I decided to rent a remote cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. I picked the place because it was isolated, cheap, and available on short notice. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room wooden structure by a lake, surrounded by miles of trees and dirt roads. That was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no cell signal, no distractions, just silence. I packed up my Jeep with the basics: food, bottled water, some books, a flashlight, a hatchet, my sleeping bag, and a small generator for power. The trip up there took about 9 hours, with the last hour on a winding gravel road that barely looked traveled. By the time I arrived, the sky was beginning to darken, and the air had that sharp autumn chill. The trees were mostly bare, the ground littered with red and brown leaves. I backed the Jeep up near the porch and stepped out, stretching my legs and looking around. The lake was just a short walk down a hill behind the cabin. Everything was dead quiet except for the breeze moving through the trees. The cabin itself looked older than it had in the pictures. The wood was worn, the paint faded, and the windows had smudges and grime on the glass. But it was standing, and it had a door that locked. That was enough for me. Inside, it was small but usable. A cot with a foam mattress sat in one corner, a little wooden table and a single chair in the middle, a tiny wood-burning stove by the wall. There was a shelf with some old canned food left behind by previous guests. The place smelled faintly of dust and burnt wood. That first night, I got the generator running and turned on a small lamp. I heated up a can of chili on the stove and ate while sitting outside on the porch, staring out into the trees. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. The cold air, the silence, the feeling of being alone. It was what I had been needing. I turned in early and fell asleep almost immediately. The first few days were uneventful. I read, walked around the woods during the day, and cooked simple meals. I even tried fishing a few times at the lake, though I didn't catch anything worth keeping. I'd fall asleep as soon as it got dark, and I'd wake up with the sun. For a while, it felt peaceful. I even started thinking I could stay longer. But around the 5th day, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right with me. The first was a sound, distant and faint, almost like metal tapping against metal. Came from somewhere in the woods, maybe a few hundred yards out. I was chopping wood at the time and paused, thinking it might have been an echo or a branch falling. But the sound happened again a minute later. Tap, tap, tap. I stood still, listening. Then it stopped. I figured maybe it was an animal or something natural. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't sleep as well. Every little creak or gust of wind felt louder, more distinct. I tried to shake it off the next morning. I told myself I was just not used to this kind of isolation anymore. That afternoon, I went for a longer hike, trying to get my head straight. I followed the dirt trail that led past the lake and deeper into the forest. After maybe an hour of walking, I found something odd. It was a set of boot prints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different, and they were deeper than mine, like the person was heavier or carrying something. They led off the trail into the woods. I stared at them for a while, then turned around and went back to the cabin. I tried to forget about it, but that night I heard the tapping again. This time it was closer, maybe just past the tree line outside. It was slow and steady. Tap, 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 then silence. I sat there in the dark, with the stove crackling quietly and the lamp turned low. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally got up the nerve to look outside, I didn't see anything, just darkness and trees. The next day, I walked the perimeter around the cabin. I checked for signs of animals or people. I found nothing, but when I got back to the porch, I saw something strange. One of my firewood logs had been moved, not knocked over, moved. It was lying in the center of the porch, away from the rest of the pile. I hadn't done that. That evening, I kept the hatchet next to me. I locked the door and pushed the chair under the handle as a makeshift brace. I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, straining to hear anything outside. Sometime past midnight, I heard the tapping again, louder this time, and then a new sound like slow footsteps on dry leaves. They circled the cabin once. Then everything went quiet again. In the morning, I checked the ground. I found no footprints. Either the leaves had shifted or I was losing my mind. I didn't care anymore. I packed some stuff and drove into town. The closest gas station was about an hour away. I filled up, bought more batteries, and asked the guy at the counter if anyone else stayed out near the lake this time of year. He said not really, too cold, too far out, and most cabins were shut down for the season. I didn't tell him what I had heard. I just nodded and left. I thought maybe I'd stay one more night, then head home early. I didn't want to leave in the dark. That evening, I tried to relax again. I made some food, read for a bit, and tried to ignore the gnawing anxiety in my stomach. The woods were dead silent, too silent. Even the birds were gone. Right after I got in bed and turned off the lamp, I heard something outside again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. It started near the edge of the woods and slowly moved toward the cabin. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just stared at the ceiling, frozen. Minutes passed. Then I heard the creaking of wood on the porch. My heart was pounding. I stayed still. Something or someone was out there. I couldn't bring myself to look. I waited, gripping the hatchet under my sleeping bag. Eventually, I heard the sound retreat. Slowly, then faster until it was gone. I didn't sleep. I waited for the sun to come up. As soon as it did, I packed everything into the Jeep and left. I didn't clean up. I didn't check the porch. I just got out. On my way down the gravel road, I looked in the rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw a shape step back into the woods, but I didn't stop to look again. I never reported anything. I didn't go back. I haven't stayed in another cabin since. Sometimes, I still hear that tapping sound in my dreams. I don't know if it was a person or something else. I don't think it matters. What I do know is that there was someone out there, watching, waiting, and I was lucky to leave when I did. That cabin was supposed to be an escape, but it turned into something else. A reminder that isolation isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's just a good way to get caught alone. And sometimes something's already out there, just waiting for you to notice it. It was mid-November, right between fall and winter, when everything feels a bit off. The trees were mostly bare, the sky stayed gray all day, and the wind always had that cold bite that got to your bones. I was working too much, barely sleeping, and my chest felt tight all the time. When my cousin told me about a small cabin he used to visit in the woods years ago, he said I could go there alone for a break. I took the offer without thinking much about it. The place was about a 4-hour drive from my apartment. Most of the drive was on narrow roads that kept twisting deeper into the woods. I saw fewer and fewer houses until there weren't any at all. Just trees and the sound of tires on wet gravel. There were no signs or anything to mark the location, just a pin dropped on a GPS. When I finally arrived, I almost missed it. The cabin was tucked behind a line of tall pine trees, sitting on uneven ground next to a half-frozen creek. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood siding was faded and cracked. A few windows had dirt so thick I could barely see through them. There was no porch, just a crooked step leading to the front door. It creaked loud when I opened it. Inside smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like wet leaves left too long in a bag. Still, it had 4 walls, a roof, and I needed the break. I dropped my backpack, unrolled my sleeping bag in the only bedroom, and started settling in. There wasn't much inside. A couch with a torn cushion, a rusty stove, a tiny fridge that didn't work anymore, and an old table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water. The toilet was outside, a wooden outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin. That first day, I didn't do much. I unpacked, made a fire in the wood stove, and ate a cold sandwich. I watched the flames for a while and tried to relax, but something didn't feel right. At first, I thought it was just the silence. It was too quiet. Even in the woods, you expect to hear birds, branches moving, the wind, but it felt like the air was holding its breath. Every step I took echoed inside the cabin. Outside, it was dead still. The trees didn't move. The sky didn't change. I went to bed early just to escape it. That first night, I woke up 3 times. The first was because of a sound outside, something crunching through the leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and looked through the window, but saw nothing. Maybe it was a deer. The second time, I thought I heard a knock. Not on the door, but on the side of the cabin. Just one. I held my breath, stared at the ceiling, and waited. Nothing else happened. The third time, I was already half awake when I heard it. A soft dragging sound right outside my window. It stopped when I sat up. I didn't look outside. The next morning, everything was just as I left it. No footprints, no marks, nothing. I told myself I was tired, overworked, and my brain was playing games. I spent the day chopping wood, exploring a little, and trying to keep myself busy. There was a narrow trail that led down to the creek, and I followed it for a while. I found broken branches, old cans, and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. Nothing strange, but everything felt off, like I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, it started again. More sounds. First it was the dragging again, then footsteps circling the cabin. I waited by the door with a heavy piece of wood, thinking maybe it was some local messing with me. I even opened the door once and shined the light around. Nothing. The forest looked empty, but the feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. On the third day, I hiked farther out, trying to see if maybe there were other cabins or signs of people. I found nothing, but when I got back, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. One of the chairs at the table had been pulled out. I was sure I left both of them pushed in. I stared at it for a while, trying to think of a reason. Maybe I bumped it without knowing. Maybe it shifted, but it was far out, like someone had sat down. That night, I locked the door, propped a chair under the handle, and kept my axe next to the bed. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something inside. I heard the knocking again, this time on both sides of the cabin. I even thought I heard breathing, not loud but steady. Close. In the morning, I found the back door wide open. I hadn't even known it was there. It was behind a curtain I hadn't touched. The lock was broken. I didn't see any footprints, but the floor inside was dirty with leaf bits and what looked like wet mud. I started packing immediately. I wasn't staying another night. When I stepped outside to load my stuff, I saw something that made me stop cold. There were marks on the trees, not cuts, more like scratches, deep, wide, and low to the ground. Some looked fresh. I walked around the cabin and found more of them, circling the whole place. I don't know how I missed them before. I left before noon. I didn't tell anyone the full story, not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't understand it. There were no ghosts, no monsters, just something watching, waiting. Maybe someone had been living nearby, hidden in the woods. Maybe they didn't like me there. But when I got home, 2 days later, I opened my backpack to unpack, and I found something inside that wasn't mine. A small, smooth stone, perfectly round, tied with an old, dirty string. I never saw that cabin again. I never want to. It was late September when I decided to head up north to a remote cabin my uncle used to own. He passed away a couple years ago, and the place had just been sitting there. Nobody wanted it. It was too far from town, too isolated, no cell reception. But I wasn't looking for a vacation or anything. I just wanted some time away from everything, from work, from traffic, from people in general. I had a week of paid leave I hadn't used, so I figured why not. I packed some gear, loaded up the truck, and made the 7-hour drive from the city into the mountains. The drive wasn't bad. The roads were mostly empty once I got past the main highway. The trees were starting to turn color, yellow and orange lining both sides of the road. I passed a few scattered homes and old gas stations, but after the last town, the world just fell quiet. No more cars, no billboards, just empty road winding up through pine forest and hills. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was dipping low. I followed the narrow, bumpy path through the trees for about 20 minutes until I finally saw the roof of the place through the pines. It sat near the edge of a small ridge, backed by thicker forest. The land dropped off to the west, offering a view of the valley far below. The place looked about how I remembered it, old, plain, and quiet. Just a single-story wooden cabin with a slanted metal roof, a wide porch, and one of those ugly stone chimneys that looked like it had been patched up half a dozen times. The paint on the siding was peeling, and the wood had turned gray in places from the weather. I parked near the side and hauled my gear inside. The door creaked like it always did, and the air inside smelled musty, like old dust and pine. I didn't mind. I set my things down and gave the place a once-over. Nothing seemed out of place. Same old couch, same old kitchen. There were no signs that anyone had been here recently. No footprints in the dust. No fresh trash in the bin. The electricity was off, but I already expected that. I had brought a cooler full of food, a camping stove, a couple big water jugs, and a few battery lanterns. That first night was quiet. I made some soup, set up my sleeping bag on the old cot in the corner, and read by lantern light until I dozed off. The wind howled now and then outside, and a few times I heard something shift in the woods, but it never felt threatening. just forest noises. I actually slept pretty well. The next couple days went by slow, just like I wanted. I chopped some wood, explored a few trails near the ridge, cooked simple meals, and sat on the porch watching the trees. I saw deer once or twice, heard an owl at night. Nothing strange, nothing to make me feel uncomfortable. But on the fourth day, something changed. It started in the afternoon. I was sitting out back behind the cabin, sharpening a hatchet on a flat stone when I noticed something weird across the ridge. There's a hill about 100 yards away with a big boulder near the top. It's a clear spot. You can see it from the cabin easily. I glanced up and thought I saw a person standing near the rock. At first I figured it was just a tree stump or maybe a shadow, but I kept looking. After a few seconds, I could tell. Someone was up there, standing still, not moving, just watching. I stood up slowly, still holding the hatchet, and squinted into the sun. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, maybe wearing a jacket. But they didn't wave or call out. They didn't do anything at all, just stood there. After maybe 30 seconds, they walked away, disappearing behind the boulder and down the far side of the hill. I waited a while, but they never came back. I don't know why, but it bothered me. This place was miles from anywhere. No trails ran through that side. No one should be wandering up here without a reason. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was probably just another hiker, maybe even someone from town who knew the place. Still, I kept the hatchet closer to me the rest of the day. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I opened my eyes. Every creak from the cabin made me sit up and listen. I kept the lantern on most of the night. I even moved the cooler in front of the door just in case. The next morning, I decided to walk up to that boulder. I left right after breakfast, brought the hatchet just to be safe. The climb wasn't long, but it was steep. The ground was covered in dry needles and loose rock. When I reached the top, I looked around, trying to see if there were any boot prints or signs of someone walking. First, nothing, just wind and silence. Then, near the base of the boulder, I saw it, a small pile of cigarette butts, maybe 4 or 5, all old and bent, but not weathered enough to be from last season. Some still had the filters intact. There were also footprints, faint but real, maybe from boots. They led away from the boulder, down the far slope and into thick woods. I followed them for a bit, maybe 20 or 30 yards, but the forest got dense fast. Fallen trees, underbrush, and no clear trail. After a while, I turned back. All that day, I kept glancing at the ridge, half expecting to see that figure again. But nothing showed. No one came. Still, I couldn't relax. I didn't like the idea that someone might be out there, hiding, watching the cabin. I kept the door locked after that. Slept with the hatchet next to me. Left one lantern on low all night. The next day was the worst. I went out to the truck around noon to grab more water from the jugs I kept in the back. When I got there, I noticed something strange. The driver's door was ajar. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of that. I never leave it unlocked. Not out here. I checked inside. The glove box had been opened, papers scattered on the seat. The center console too. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell. The keys were still with me, my tools were untouched. But someone had definitely been inside. It wasn't animals. There were no claw marks, no mess, just someone searching. I stood there for a while, scanning the woods around me. The forest was still. No sounds but wind in the trees. I felt exposed, like I was standing on a stage. I went back inside fast, locked the door behind me, and pulled the shades shut. That evening, I heard the first real sound that made my stomach turn. I was sitting on the floor inside the cabin, sorting through my things, when I heard soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, measured, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, listening. Then came the knock, light, deliberate. 2 soft taps on the door. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. My heart was hammering in my ears. I grabbed the hatchet and crawled into the corner behind the wood stove, out of sight from the windows. I waited like that for what felt like an hour. No more knocks, no voices, just silence. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to peek through a crack in the curtains. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the floor with the hatchet in my hand, lantern low, every sense on edge. The first light, I packed my gear. I didn't care if I had 3 days left on my trip. I wanted out. I didn't even eat. Just threw everything in the truck and started the engine. That's when I saw it, muddy footprints, leading from the trees across the clearing, up the porch steps and right to the door. Big prints, deep ones, probably men's boots, the same kind I saw near the boulder. I drove out of there fast. Didn't stop until I hit the first town 2 hours away. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station, shaking, trying to calm myself. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what would I say? That someone knocked on my door and left? That someone went through my truck and stood on a ridge? I had no proof, no plates, no names. Instead, I drove home. I didn't tell anyone about what happened until weeks later. I kept going over it in my head, wondering if maybe I imagined parts of it. But I didn't. The footprints were real. The cigarette butts. The knock. I looked up some maps after I got back. Turns out, about 5 miles west of the cabin, there's an area that used to be part of an old logging camp back in the 80s. It's not on most current maps. A few buildings still stand out there. Some squatters have been known to pass through now and then. I figure whoever I saw came from there. I sold the cabin 3 months later. Cheap. Didn't even care about the money. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to wonder if the man I saw on the ridge was still out there, watching, waiting. I still think about that knock sometimes. How calm it was. How slow and sure. Like whoever it was, they weren't afraid at all. Like they knew I was in there. Like they were trying to see how I'd react. I haven't been back to the woods since. I took a week off work in late January to clear my head. Things had been piling up in my life, and I felt like I couldn't breathe properly anymore. Everything seemed loud. My phone, the city, my job, even my own thoughts. I needed space, away from people, away from everything. I found a cabin listed online. It was buried deep in the mountains of Montana, at the end of an unpaved road. It didn't have internet, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles. Just trees, snow, and silence. It sounded perfect. The cabin was small, old, and made of dark wood. There was a narrow porch on the front, a crooked chimney, and 2 small windows that looked out toward a frozen stream. It had a wood-burning stove for heat, a gas stove for cooking, and a small bedroom with a lumpy mattress. The place looked like no one had used it in a while, but it was clean enough. I brought in my bags, lit the stove, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful, quiet retreat. The first night was calm. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees outside and the occasional crack from the wood stove. I cooked some canned soup, sat by the fire with a book, and eventually fell asleep wrapped in a thick blanket. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I went outside to explore the area. Snow came up to my calves, but I had boots and gear for it. I walked around the stream, followed some tracks in the snow, deer, maybe a fox. The cold bit at my face, but I didn't mind. It was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I stood out there for nearly an hour, breathing in the sharp winter air, before heading back inside. Around noon, clouds began to roll in. I checked the weather radio I brought with me and heard that a snowstorm was expected to hit that evening. I wasn't worried. I had enough food and wood to last me the whole week. I made sure everything was secure, brought in extra firewood, and locked the door. That night, the wind picked up. It howled around the cabin, making the walls creak and groan. I stayed by the fire, listening to it, trying to read but unable to focus. The wind got louder as the night went on, and snow slammed against the windows like tiny fists. I eventually went to bed, though I barely slept. The storm was too loud. The next morning, the world outside was gone. Everything was white. The porch, the trees, the path I had taken the day before, all buried under what looked like several feet of snow. I opened the door and saw that snow had piled up against it, almost trapping me inside. I dug out a small path with the shovel I found leaning against the side of the cabin. The sky was still gray, and the air had a stillness that didn't feel right. I went back inside and lit the stove again. I made oatmeal and sat at the small wooden table by the window, looking out at nothing but snow. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but they were deep and too evenly spaced. Human. Someone had walked through the snow, past my cabin, during the night. The tracks came from the tree line, passed close to my window, and kept going. But there were no return tracks, just a single trail like someone walked past and kept going into the woods. I stared at the tracks for a long time. I hadn't heard anything. No knocking, no voices, no footsteps. The wind had probably covered any noise. I went outside, followed the tracks for a few yards before stopping. I couldn't see where they led, and I wasn't going to get lost in the woods during a snowstorm. I went back inside and locked the door. That day dragged. I kept looking out the window, checking the tracks. Still only one set. I listened for any sounds. Nothing. The silence became heavy. I turned the radio on again. The weather wasn't improving. More snow was expected, maybe another 2 days of it. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. I kept thinking about the tracks. Who had been out there? Why didn't they come to the door? Were they lost? Hiding? Just passing through? Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly, cold sweat on my neck. I didn't know why I woke up, but something felt wrong. The fire had gone out. The room was freezing. I got up, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and walked into the living room to restart the fire. As I was placing logs into the stove, I heard it. Snow crunching. I froze. The sound came from the side of the cabin, near the window. Just one crunch, then another. Slow, deliberate. Someone was outside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I listened. The crunching stopped. I waited for minutes. Nothing. I crept toward the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. I saw nothing, just darkness. I stayed on the floor next to the stove for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I checked the window again. New tracks, same size, same pattern. They had come from the tree line again, walked past the window, and disappeared around the corner of the cabin. Still no return tracks. I went out and followed them carefully. They circled the cabin once, then stopped at the back wall. Just stopped. No return prints, no body prints, just gone, like whoever it was vanished. I started to feel something I hadn't in a long time. Real fear, not panic, not anxiety. Cold, sharp fear. I went back inside, locked the door, closed the curtains, and kept the hatchet I found in the woodpile near me at all times. That day, I didn't eat much. I sat near the stove and listened. All day, I kept thinking I heard things. A knock, a footstep, a whisper of movement, but I couldn't be sure. Snow still fell outside, and the gray sky never changed. That night was worse. Around 10 p.m., I heard movement again. This time it was faster. Not slow, quiet steps. It was something running past the cabin. I got up, grabbed the hatchet, and stood in the corner of the room. Then it stopped. I waited. Then I heard something tap against the back door. A soft, sharp knock, just once. I didn't move. I stayed frozen in the dark for what felt like hours. The knock never came again. I didn't look outside. Couldn't. The storm finally started to die the next morning. The radio said it would be clear by noon. I checked the door and window. More tracks. This time, they led from the back door to the woods. Finally, a return trail. Whoever it was had left. I stayed locked in all day. I didn't trust it. I didn't want to go outside until I could leave completely. I started packing my things that night. I barely slept again. The next morning, the sun came out. It was the first time I saw blue sky since I arrived. I packed the car, started the engine, and drove down the road as far as I could. I had to shovel some snow, move fallen branches, but I eventually made it back to the main road. I didn't stop. I drove straight home, through the day and night. A week later, I got a call from the property owner. He asked how the trip went. I told him it was quiet, cold, and that I didn't see anyone. He sounded surprised. He said someone had broken into a cabin a few miles away during the storm. Nothing was stolen, but footprints were found all around it. No one ever figured out who it was. I didn't say anything. I just hung up and sat on the floor of my apartment, thinking about those footsteps. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But sometimes, when I hear wind against the windows at night, I remember how it sounded in that cabin, how quiet the snow was, and how someone can walk right past your window without making a sound. I was 34 when I rented that old cabin in early October. It sat about 20 miles outside a town called Morgan Pines, deep in northern Idaho. The cabin was surrounded by forest on all sides, with only one gravel road leading in and out. The trees were tall and packed tight, mostly pine and birch, and they seemed to swallow sound. I picked that cabin for a reason. I had just quit my job, burned out after nearly 10 years in a concrete office building, and I needed space to think, space to breathe. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful break from everything. No cell signal, no neighbors, no traffic, just me, the trees, and my thoughts. I paid for the cabin for 6 weeks up front. The owner, a retired guy named Walter, left the key for me in a padlocked box attached to the deck. He warned me ahead of time that the place was rough. No running water, just a big blue barrel outside to catch rain. No electricity, but there was a wood stove and a solar-powered lantern. That was fine. I wasn't planning to write a book or stream movies. I just wanted to reset. The first week was quiet. Every morning, I made instant coffee over the propane stove and sat on the front steps to drink it, watching mist crawl across the tree line. There was no sound except birds and wind. At night, I read books by lantern or sat in the dark, listening to the fire crackle in the stove. My sleep got better, deeper. I felt like my brain was finally starting to slow down. But things changed the second week. Little things at first. I'd go outside in the morning and see that one of the wooden planks on the porch looked out of place, just slightly shifted. Or I'd find the barrel lid moved a few inches to the side like someone had tried to peek inside. I figured it was wind or raccoons. That seemed reasonable enough. Still, I started locking the door at night, even though I knew no one should be out there. Then, on the 9th night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The fire had burned low, so the cabin was cold. I could hear the wind pushing against the trees. I rolled over and was about to drift back off when I heard it, wood creaking. Just one loud, deliberate creak from the porch, like someone had stepped on it slowly. I lay still. My heart started pounding, and my breathing went shallow. I waited for another sound, but nothing came. After a few minutes, I sat up and listened harder. Silence. I convinced myself it was the wood contracting in the cold. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to see anything outside that window. I just stayed in bed with my heart beating too fast until I fell asleep again. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. The leaves were moving gently in the wind. Everything looked normal, but then I noticed a single footprint in the dirt near the side of the cabin. A boot print, wide and deep like someone had stood there for a while. It wasn't mine. I hadn't walked around that side. It was pointed straight at the cabin wall, directly under the bedroom window. I didn't know what to think. It hadn't rained, so the ground had kept the imprint clear. It was about size 11, maybe 12, deep enough to suggest the person had been heavy. There were no other prints leading to or away from it. That bothered me more than anything. It was just that one. Like someone had stood there in the night and watched me through the window. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I kept checking over my shoulder, jumping at sounds that I wouldn't have noticed before. At nightfall, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I kept the fire going all night and barely slept. On the 11th day, I went for a walk to clear my head. I had a trail I followed about half a mile from the cabin that looped through the woods and came back around. I did it every other day to keep from feeling stiff. But this time, I noticed something new. About 15 minutes into the walk, I spotted an old tree stump just off the trail. On top of it sat a small pile of pine cones, neatly stacked in a triangle shape. I hadn't seen that before. It wasn't natural, too precise. Someone had done that on purpose. I walked over, stared at it for a while, and then knocked it over with a stick. Felt stupid, but something about it made me uncomfortable. I didn't want anything out there that made me feel watched. That night, I left the lantern off. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark and stared out the window for hours, waiting to see movement between the trees. I didn't see anything, but the fear didn't leave. I slept with the axe by my bed. On the 12th day, I found something that pushed everything over the edge. It was early morning, fog still hanging in the woods. I stepped outside with my coffee and noticed something shiny stuck to the side of the cabin near the ground. I walked over and crouched down. It was a nail, a long rusty nail jammed into the wood at an odd angle. At first, I thought it was just a leftover from old repairs, but when I looked closer, I saw that a piece of thin wire was tied to it. The wire ran down into the dirt and disappeared under a pile of dead leaves. I followed the wire. It was strung along the ground, half hidden, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It stretched about 20 feet out from the cabin and stopped at a tree. Wrapped around the tree was a small, rusty bell, a tripwire. Someone had set up a tripwire that would ring if you crossed it. That wasn't there when I arrived. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my mouth go dry. Someone had been out there. Someone had been close enough to rig that up without me noticing. I took it all apart and brought the wire and bell inside, then closed the shutters and sat at the table with my thoughts spinning. I didn't know what to do. The cabin didn't have a phone, and I couldn't get signal until I drove back toward town. But I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to walk out into the woods and end up running right into whoever had been watching me. I kept thinking maybe it was just some hunter or a weird local playing a prank, but that didn't make sense. Why watch the cabin? Why set a trap? Why no footprints? I stayed inside all day. By nightfall, I'd barely moved from the table. I didn't light the fire. I didn't want any light coming from the windows. I sat in the dark, listening, the axe across my lap. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, careful, moving slowly around the cabin. I didn't move. I held my breath and just listened. The steps circled once, then stopped. I heard the faintest sound of something brushing against the side wall. Then nothing. I stayed like that until dawn. When it got light enough, I opened the door and stepped outside with the axe still in my hand. I walked the full perimeter of the cabin. I saw more boot prints, different spots, no pattern, like someone had been walking slow circles around the place. That was it. I made the decision to leave. I packed fast. Just the essentials: my wallet, my keys, food, flashlight, map. I threw it into the backpack and didn't even bother folding anything. I got into my truck and backed out onto the gravel road, bouncing hard over the rocks. The sun was still low, the trees casting long shadows across the road. About 10 minutes into the drive, I came around a bend and hit the brakes. In the middle of the road, there was a pile of branches, thick ones stacked high, not fallen, placed, blocking the way. It wasn't natural. I got out and started dragging them to the side. My heart was racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out of the woods. It took me almost 20 minutes to clear the path enough to get around it. When I finally did, I didn't stop driving until I hit paved road again. I didn't go back to the cabin. I called Walter from a diner about 40 miles away and told him I was done early. I didn't explain. I just left the key with the waitress and told him to pick it up there. It's been over a year since that happened. I think about it almost every day. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. I've replayed every detail in my head over and over. The tripwire, the pine cones, the footprints, the slow steps at night. And the thing that haunts me the most is something I didn't notice until weeks later. I was going through my backpack, reorganizing stuff I had taken from the cabin, and I found my old notebook. It was one of those leather-bound journals I used to write down ideas and thoughts while I was up there. I flipped through it casually, half expecting to see old sketches or grocery lists. Near the back, there was a page I didn't remember writing on. It just had 5 words in big, shaky letters. "I like watching you sleep." That's when I realized someone had been inside while I was sleeping. It was the middle of October when I drove up into the northern part of Minnesota, looking for some quiet. I had been working non-stop for nearly a year without any real break, and my nerves were shot. I had this small family-owned cabin I used a few times before. Nothing fancy, just a basic wooden structure about 40 miles from the nearest town. There was no phone service, no internet, and only a propane generator to keep the lights on. The idea of spending a week there without any emails or phone calls sounded perfect. I packed the truck with food, firewood, my hunting rifle, and a few books. I got there late in the afternoon. The gravel road that led to the cabin was half covered in fallen leaves. It felt like the trees were closing in as I drove further into the woods. I had to park about 100 feet from the cabin because a fallen log blocked the final stretch. I didn't mind. The air was crisp, and the silence was something I had been craving. After unloading everything, I made a fire inside using the old stone fireplace. The place smelled the same as always, a mix of burnt wood and aged timber. The first night was uneventful. I heated some canned soup on the gas stove, read a few chapters from a book, and fell asleep early. The silence here was always so complete that it felt like the world stopped spinning when the sun went down. The next day, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I followed a deer trail for about an hour, not looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to clear my head. When I got back, I noticed a strange pattern of dirt on the porch. At first, I thought maybe an animal had come by, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But the pattern didn't look like animal prints. It looked more like something had been dragged. The trail stopped at the front step. I figured it could have been something simple like a branch or even my own boot tracks messing with my head. I brushed it off. The third night was when things started to get strange. Around midnight, I was woken up by a thud outside. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to jolt me out of sleep. I stayed in bed for a while, listening. There were no other sounds, no footsteps, no wind, just that one noise and then nothing. I eventually convinced myself it was just something falling from a tree. Maybe a branch had snapped. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if I could find whatever had made the noise. About 15 feet from the side window, I found a set of footprints in the soft soil. They were clearly boot prints, not animal tracks. The strange part was they led from the woods toward the cabin but didn't lead back. I tried to match them to my own boots, but they were different, wider and deeper. Someone had been there, close to the cabin, in the middle of the night. That didn't sit well with me. I spent the rest of the day double-checking all the doors and windows. The front and back doors had deadbolts, and I had brought along a small chain lock I installed on the front door just in case. I also moved the rifle to a spot near the bed. It was loaded but with the safety on. I didn't expect to need it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night I didn't sleep much. Every creak in the wood or gust of wind made my ears perk up. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard what sounded like someone walking outside. Slow, steady steps around the side of the cabin. I froze. My breathing slowed, and I strained to hear every movement. The footsteps stopped near the back wall. Then came a soft tapping like fingernails or maybe a small stick against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After maybe 30 seconds, it stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise. When it got light out, I stepped outside with the rifle. I checked the back of the cabin and saw new boot prints. Same size as before. They circled the cabin and stopped at the back window. I looked at the window closely. There were marks on the glass, smudges, like someone had pressed their face or hand against it. I felt this cold wave crawl up my back. I knew someone had been watching me. I wanted to leave, but I kept telling myself it was probably a hunter or some lost hiker who thought the cabin was empty. That's what I told myself. I stayed one more night. This time I made sure every window was locked. I moved a chair in front of the front door and put some empty tin cans on the doorknob so they'd fall and make noise if someone tried to come in. I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't slow. It was quick, frantic steps, like someone was running around the outside. Then silence. Then a bang on the back wall. Not a tap, a bang. A solid hit like someone threw their shoulder into the wall. I sat there with the rifle pointed at the door. I didn't move until the sun came up. When I stepped outside, I saw the back wall had been hit hard enough to leave a dent in the siding. There were fresh boot prints leading into the woods but not coming back. I'd had enough. I packed everything up, tossed it in the truck, and left that morning. I didn't care about the fallen tree blocking the drive. I backed the truck through the brush until I got back on the gravel road. I drove all the way to a motel in town and checked in. That night, I finally slept. A few days later, I called the county sheriff's office and told them what happened. They sent a deputy to check out the cabin. He called me back and said he didn't find anything unusual. No signs of forced entry. No one had broken in. But he did mention something odd. He said the ground around the cabin was covered in boot prints. Some were deep, like the person had been running. Others were scattered in strange patterns. He said it looked like someone had been pacing in circles for hours. He asked if I had been walking around the cabin a lot. I told him no. I haven't gone back since. I still have the key. Sometimes I take it out of the drawer and look at it, wondering who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Maybe they were testing the place, seeing if anyone would fight back. Or maybe they were just waiting. I try not to think about it too much. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that tapping sound. I spent a week alone in a remote cabin last fall. I needed a break from everything. I had taken too much stress from work and barely slept at night. I couldn't focus anymore. I wasn't myself. So, I planned a trip far away from the city, away from people, phones, meetings, alarms, and everything else that was making my head feel like it would split open. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest near a small town in northern Idaho. It sat next to a slow-moving creek and was surrounded by thick woods. No neighbors, no traffic, just a narrow gravel road that led in from the highway about 20 miles out. I found the listing online. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, not modern at all. It had a tin roof, a wood stove, one bedroom, and no internet. That was what I wanted. I didn't need luxury. I needed peace. I arrived around noon on a Sunday. The air was already cold, and the trees were shedding leaves fast. Patches of yellow and orange carpeted the ground. I unpacked everything into the cabin. Canned food, bottled water, some firewood, clothes, a sleeping bag, and a few books. I had a small battery-powered radio and a flashlight with extra batteries. The place had no electricity, only a gas stove and a small propane tank for basic cooking. There was a hand pump for water, but I still preferred the bottled kind. The outhouse was about 30 feet from the cabin, hidden behind some trees. That first day passed quietly. I stacked firewood near the stove, tested the locks on the doors and windows, and sat on the porch for hours. The only sounds were birds, wind through the trees, and the soft bubbling of the creek. It was perfect. By nightfall, the air dropped sharply. I lit a small fire in the stove, cooked beans on the gas burner, and read a book until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I had no cell phone signal, which was fine. I hadn't planned on talking to anyone anyway. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day was more or less the same. I went on a short walk down the creek, explored the edge of the woods, and gathered some dry kindling. I didn't go far. I wasn't used to the woods and didn't want to get lost. I didn't bring any weapons either, just a pocket knife, so I stayed close. Later that evening, just as the sun was setting, I noticed something odd in the distance. While standing at the creek's edge, I looked toward a dense patch of trees across the water. Something moved. It wasn't big, but it was fast. Maybe a deer, I thought, or a coyote. It disappeared quickly into the woods, and I shrugged it off. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside, light crunching. It sounded like footsteps on dry leaves. I tried to convince myself it was animals, probably raccoons. I even looked out the window once, but it was pitch dark, and I couldn't see anything. The woods are a different kind of dark. You can't even see your hand unless the moon is out, and it wasn't. On the third day, I felt on edge. I didn't enjoy the quiet as much. Every sound made me turn my head. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. At one point, I walked around the cabin and noticed something strange. One of the small windows on the side had muddy smudges on the glass, like something had touched it. The marks weren't clear, just dirty streaks. Maybe a raccoon again. I wiped it off with a rag and didn't think much more of it. But that night, the sounds returned, and they were louder. This time, it was definitely footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching around the cabin. It would circle, stop, then start again. I held my breath. I turned off the lantern and stood quietly in the dark, trying to listen. At one point, the footsteps stopped near the porch. Then I heard the soft creak of the wooden step. I didn't move. After a minute, the sound was gone. I barely slept that night. My heart wouldn't slow down. I stayed awake with my flashlight on my lap, pointed toward the door, but nothing else happened. By morning, I looked out and saw nothing out of place. No footprints that I could see, but the ground was covered in leaves, so it would be hard to tell anyway. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I felt uneasy. I didn't go down to the creek. I didn't read. I kept staring out the windows, scanning the trees. I started to question if I was imagining things. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe it was just animals. Still, I grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and kept it next to me, just in case. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud thud. Came from the front wall. I jumped up, heart racing, and grabbed my flashlight. I turned it on and scanned the small cabin. Everything inside looked untouched. I moved slowly toward the door and listened. I couldn't hear anything at first. Then the sound came again. A soft scraping along the wall, slow and steady. I wanted to shout, to scare it off, but my throat was dry. I kept the flashlight aimed at the door and waited. The scraping stopped, then nothing. In the morning, I found scratches along the wooden siding near the porch. Long, horizontal marks. Not deep, but not natural either. I walked around the cabin again. I found more smudges on the windows, this time on 2 different sides of the cabin. Something had been walking around the place. It wasn't just one animal. Or maybe it was, but it knew I was inside. On the 5th night, I barely let the fire go out. I kept it burning low all night so I could see better. I didn't sleep much. I heard nothing that night, but the silence felt worse than the sounds. Like something was waiting. The 6th day, I made up my mind. I was gonna leave a day early. I couldn't take it anymore. The peace I wanted had turned into constant stress. I packed most of my stuff back into the car and kept just a few things inside to get me through one more night. At dusk, I double-checked the doors and windows. I blocked the door with a chair. I even tied one end of a small metal pan to the inside knob with twine and placed it on the floor, so if anyone opened the door, it would fall and make noise. It was a stupid homemade alarm, but it made me feel a little better. That final night, I stayed up in my sleeping bag with the flashlight ready. I kept the fire going. I didn't read. I just stared at the door and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Until around 3 a.m., I heard the back window creak. Not the front door this time. The back window. I turned the flashlight toward it. The beam was weak now, the batteries fading. I grabbed the extra set and swapped them fast. When the new light came on, I aimed it at the window. A face was staring back at me, not pressed to the glass. Not shouting, just staring. It was a man, bearded, dirty, wearing a torn jacket. His eyes looked wide and alert, almost crazy. He didn't flinch when the light hit him. He just stared. I froze. Then he ducked down and disappeared. I ran to the window and locked it tighter, even though it was already latched. I pulled the wooden table in front of it and stacked a chair on top. I moved the firewood next to it. I built a barricade, my hands shaking the whole time. Then I sat with my back to the wall, clutching the flashlight and the firewood club. I didn't hear him again. At dawn, I grabbed the last of my things, threw them in the car, and drove out without looking back. I didn't eat. I didn't check anything. I didn't care. When I got back to town, I stopped at a diner and used their payphone to call the sheriff's office. I told them what happened. They sent a car out to check, but they said they didn't find anyone, just some footprints. They figured it was a drifter or someone living off the land. Not uncommon out there. They said they'd keep an eye out. I didn't go back. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to forget that face. The way he looked at me, not like he was curious or surprised, like he had been watching me the whole time. Since then, I don't camp. I don't hike. I don't even like road trips anymore. And sometimes, even now, I still dream about that cabin. And the face in the window. I never thought I'd end up alone in a remote mountain cabin. Not after everything that happened the year before. But when my cousin offered it to me for 2 weeks to get away from the stress of city life, I figured it wouldn't hurt. He had owned the place for a few years but didn't go up often. It was deep in the forest, about 4 hours from the nearest decent-sized town. No phone signal, no internet, just trees and the old cabin. That sounded like peace to me. I didn't realize how wrong I was until it was too late. I drove up in early May, just when the weather was warm enough that I didn't need heavy clothes, but cool enough at night that the air felt crisp. The drive up there was long, and the last 30 minutes were rough. Bumpy dirt roads twisting through thick trees with no signs, no fences, no houses. The directions were written down on a wrinkled piece of paper my cousin had given me, and without GPS, I had to trust my eyes and instincts. I got lost once and had to backtrack half a mile when I realized I'd taken a wrong turn near a pile of old logs. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. It was built with old timber and had that worn-out charm. Peeling dark brown paint, a little porch with 2 chairs, and a rusty wind chime that barely moved. The air was quiet. No birds chirping, no wind, just complete stillness. It wasn't creepy right away. In fact, it felt calm. I unpacked the basics from the trunk. Canned food, a cooler of drinks, clothes, my small camping stove, and a box of paperbacks. I didn't bring much since there was supposed to be enough in the cabin to get by. A bed, a working sink with water from a pump, a propane heater, and a wood stove in case the nights got really cold. Inside, the place smelled like dry wood and dust. There were some cobwebs in the corners, but otherwise, it was cleaner than I expected. The windows were dirty, the kind of dirty that comes from years of weather slapping against them, and the wooden floor creaked under every step I took. I didn't mind. I set my stuff down, cracked open a bottle of water, and sat on the porch to breathe in the still air. The first 2 days were fine. I read, went for short hikes along the trails that curved through the trees, and took some photos of birds and mushrooms. It was peaceful, the kind of peaceful that puts you to sleep easily. I didn't see a single person, not even a plane overhead. The silence felt like a blanket, and I let it wrap around me. But by the 3rd day, something felt different. It started with the tracks. I woke up around 6 a.m. to step outside and get some air. The ground was still damp from overnight rain, and there were boot prints in the mud just outside the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine. I had walked around the area the day before, but these were deeper, fresher, and facing the cabin, as if someone had walked up to the porch and turned around. There were no prints leading away. I looked around the woods for signs of anyone. Maybe a hiker, a hunter, anyone who might have gotten lost. But there was no one, and the trail around the cabin was still undisturbed except for those prints. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a leftover from when I arrived and the rain hadn't erased them yet. I forced myself not to overthink it. But that day, I didn't go far. I stayed within sight of the cabin. I kept checking over my shoulder while I read on the porch. I listened for twigs breaking or animals moving through the brush. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the old mattress in the corner of the cabin, staring at the ceiling. The forest outside was dead silent. I heard no wind, no owls, not even bugs. Just stillness like the world had paused. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move outside. Not a twig snapping, not an animal scurrying. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves and sticks around the cabin. I held my breath. The sound circled the cabin once, slowly, as if someone was walking around it and stopping to look in each window. I was lying there in the dark, frozen, barely breathing. The footsteps reached the front porch. I heard a slight creak, like someone pressing down on one of the old wooden steps. Then silence. I waited, staring at the front door. I could just barely make it out in the dark. No knock, no jiggling handle, nothing. I stayed still for an hour before I finally fell asleep from exhaustion, my heart still racing. The next morning, I opened the door slowly, ready for anything. Nothing was there, but the boot prints were back. This time clearer and more of them. They went from the trail up to the porch around the cabin and stopped near the back window. I followed them, checking every corner of the place, but found nothing. No people, no signs of someone camping nearby, no tire tracks. That's when I started keeping a knife on me. The next few days got worse. I heard the same slow footsteps at night. Never running, never fast. Always walking, always deliberate. And I never saw who it was. I started keeping the lights off. I sat in the dark with the knife in my hand, watching the door, straining to hear past the walls. One morning, I found the firewood I stacked neatly outside had been moved. Not just scattered, but arranged, stacked in a circle like someone was trying to leave a message. That same day, I noticed scratches along the edge of the front door, like someone had pressed a blade or a sharp rock against the wood and dragged it downward, over and over. I stopped going outside as much. I ate less. My sleep got worse. I was running low on energy and started counting the days until I'd leave. I didn't feel safe, but I had no way to call anyone. No cell signal, no landline. The nearest gas station was hours away on foot. Then one night it got worse. I was in bed again, knife under the pillow, flashlight near my hand. I had stayed up reading with my headlamp until late and finally drifted off around 1:30. I was woken up an hour later by the sound of something pressing against the cabin wall. Not a knock, a slow push like someone leaning their full weight into it. Then the door creaked, not open, just the sound of pressure against it. I slid out of bed, grabbed the knife, and crouched near the corner of the room. The pressure stopped. Then came the sound of breathing, heavy, slow breathing just outside the door. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The breathing stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed, 20, and then the back window shattered. Glass scattered across the floor like a bucket of coins. I ran into the kitchen, heart pounding, and shined my flashlight toward the broken window. Nothing there, just the cool night air pouring in. I stood still, holding the knife tight, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. Whoever broke it didn't come inside. They just left. I waited until morning, never closing my eyes. When the sun finally came up, I packed my bag. I didn't care about the food or the books. I took the essentials and started hiking out. I didn't even bother locking the cabin behind me. I followed the dirt trail until I reached the road and walked for miles until a car finally passed and gave me a ride to town. I didn't say much. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just wanted to get home. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my cousin. He had gone up to the cabin after I left to check on the place. He said it looked like someone had ransacked it. Broken window, scratches on the door, firewood scattered. He thought maybe a bear had come through. But bears don't walk around cabins at night. Bears don't breathe against doors. Bears don't leave deep boot prints. Then he told me something that made my stomach turn. He said when he was cleaning up, he found a trapdoor in the crawl space beneath the cabin. It had been hidden under a pile of rotted wood and tools. He never noticed it before. He thought maybe it had been used by whoever built the place decades ago. But when he opened it, he found something worse. Food wrappers, a sleeping bag, empty water bottles, a lantern. Someone had been living under the cabin, watching me the whole time I was there. Someone had been beneath the floorboards, crawling out at night, circling the cabin, watching me sleep. He said the place gave him the creeps. He boarded it up and said he was going to sell it. I never went back. I still think about it every night. About the man who watched me through the walls. I wonder how long he had been there. How many people had stayed before me? How many never made it out? I'm lucky I did. I'm not really the type of person who scares easily. I've been in the woods plenty of times, done solo hikes, stayed in backwoods cabins, and even camped out completely off the grid with nothing but a tarp and some food. But nothing ever got to me like what happened at that old cabin in northern Idaho back in 2018. I still think about it way more than I should. I've tried to let it go, but some things just stay with you. It started when I decided I needed a break from everything. Work was dragging me down, and the city noise had been messing with my sleep. I needed silence, not just quiet, real silence, the kind you can only get deep in the woods. I started looking for a place online, something way out there, nothing fancy. I didn't want a hot tub or a stocked pantry or cell service. I wanted bare bones. After a while, I found it. A guy was renting out a one-room hunting cabin for dirt cheap. Said it was primitive up in the Selway Bitterroot wilderness. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. The cabin sat a few miles off a dirt road. I had to leave my truck parked in a small clearing and hike the rest of the way in. The trail was barely visible, but the directions were clear enough, and I managed to find the place just as the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. It was a small log structure, roof slanted with moss, a single window, and a crooked chimney made of old stones. It looked solid though. Whoever built it had taken care to make it last. Inside was what you'd expect: a small cot, a wood-burning stove, a shelf with some cooking supplies, a table with a chair. There was even a rusty hatchet leaning in the corner. I felt good about it. It was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my pack and opened the single shutter. Cool forest air drifted in, along with the smell of pine and damp moss. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The first day and night were uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up a can of stew, and read a book by flashlight until I fell asleep. The silence was heavy, but comforting. No traffic, no neighbors, no barking dogs. Just the occasional rustle of trees or a night bird calling out in the distance. The second day, I did a bit of exploring. The forest around the cabin was thick, but walkable. I found a creek about a 15-minute hike west, where I filtered some water. The trees were so dense in parts that barely any sunlight made it to the ground. It was beautiful but a little disorienting. Easy to get turned around if you weren't paying attention. So I kept track of my path and marked a few trees along the way. That night, I woke up once to what sounded like something moving outside, probably just a deer or a raccoon. I didn't think much of it. Animals are curious. I went back to sleep. The third day is when things started to feel strange. I was outside chopping some wood for the stove when I noticed something odd. On the trail I had used to reach the creek, one of the trees I had marked with my knife was now stripped. Not just the bark, but chunks of the wood itself were missing, like something had clawed it. I bent down to look closer. Whatever did it had real strength. There were deep gouges running down the trunk. Bears were possible in the area, but this looked off. The claw marks weren't spaced the way I'd seen in pictures or guides. They were closer together, deeper, and more erratic. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it had started to rot. Maybe it was just weathering. I went back to chopping wood, but something about it sat wrong in my head. That night, I had a hard time falling asleep. I kept thinking about those marks. I ended up leaving the flashlight on beside me. I didn't want total darkness. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling, that weird instinct that someone is near you. I sat up in the cot and just listened. First, it was dead quiet, but after a minute, I heard it. A slow, rhythmic crunch. Footsteps, but they weren't coming from the trail. They were circling the cabin. Whoever it was didn't have a light, and they weren't saying anything. Just slow steps moving in a wide loop. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. I kept my eyes on the window. Then, just as quietly as they had come, the steps stopped. No door knock, no sound at all. I waited, heart pounding in my throat. Eventually, I must have passed out from exhaustion because I woke up to sunlight hitting the wall. I went outside and looked around. The ground was soft from the night rain, and there were footprints. Not shoes, not boots, bare feet. They were long and narrow, and there were at least 3 distinct prints spaced like a person had been walking slowly, heel to toe. They circled the cabin twice. then disappeared back into the woods. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. It made no sense. Who the hell walks barefoot this far out? There were no other cabins nearby. No hiking trails. Nothing. I felt this sharp tension in my chest that wouldn't go away. I kept telling myself it was some weird backwoods guy. Maybe someone lost or mentally unstable. But even that didn't sit right. Something felt more wrong than that. I packed my stuff right then. I didn't care if I had 4 more days left on the reservation. I just wanted to get back to the truck and go. The hike back was rough. Every sound made me flinch. I kept checking over my shoulder. At one point, I was sure I heard something behind me, so I stopped and listened. Nothing. But I didn't relax until I saw my truck through the trees. When I got there, I threw my gear into the bed and got inside. That's when I noticed it. The driver's side door was unlocked. I never leave it unlocked, ever, and I was sure I had locked it when I left. I sat there for a minute, staring at the door. Then I turned the key. The engine started fine, but as I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something was hanging from a low branch about 30 feet behind the truck. I stopped and got out. It was my compass, the one I kept in my backpack. It was hanging from a string, tied in a perfect knot, dangling like bait. That hit me hard. Someone had gone through my gear. They had followed me, maybe even watched me the whole time. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin and left me a compass in the woods? There was no real crime, nothing to investigate, but the feeling I had didn't fade. I barely slept the next few weeks. Every creak in my apartment made me jump. I started carrying a knife around even at home. Months went by. I tried to forget, told myself it was just a weird experience. Then one day I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a Polaroid photo. It showed the outside of that cabin, but it wasn't taken from the front. It was from the treeline, like someone watching. And in the corner of the photo, near the edge of the frame, I could see my own silhouette inside the window. I moved a week later. New city, new apartment, new job. I haven't been back in the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I needed to get away from everything. Work, city noise, constant phone notifications, all of it. I had been running on empty for months. One morning, I woke up with a pounding in my chest and couldn't breathe. The doctor called it stress-induced panic. I called it a sign. I took a leave of absence, packed what I needed, and drove up to a remote cabin I found online. It was buried deep in the woods, a few hours away from the nearest town. The owner had left the keys in a lockbox outside. It was an old place, nothing fancy, just what I was looking for. Wooden walls, a small porch, 1 bedroom, and no internet. The gravel road leading up to it was so narrow and overgrown that I scraped the side of my car against a bush trying to squeeze through. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. I stepped onto the porch and paused, listening. Nothing. No cars, no people, no phones. Just the soft rustling of trees and birds chirping somewhere far off. Felt good. Inside, the place smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened in a while. I dropped my bags by the couch and opened all the windows. The breeze pushed through the rooms and cleared the air a little. The furniture was basic but solid. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen with old appliances, a bedroom with a firm mattress, and a tiny bathroom that smelled like mildew. I didn't mind. I hadn't come here for comfort. That first night was quiet. I built a small fire in the wood stove even though it wasn't too cold. The crackling helped fill the silence. I made instant noodles, read a few pages from a paperback I brought, and went to bed early. I thought I would have trouble sleeping, but I passed out as soon as I lay down. The next morning, I walked a little trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, but it looked like people had used it before. It weaved through tall trees, and I followed it for about 30 minutes before turning back. I didn't want to get lost. I spent most of the day reading, chopping firewood, and sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. But something started to feel off by the 3rd day. I was coming back from a short walk in the afternoon when I noticed boot prints near the porch. I hadn't seen them before. They looked fresh, deep, like someone had been standing still there. I told myself maybe they were mine. Maybe I forgot I had walked that way, but I checked my boots. The tread didn't match. These were wider and the pattern was different. My chest tightened. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just still woods and shadows. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something outside. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on leaves. I held my breath. I didn't have a gun, just a fire poker beside the stove. I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, until the sky began to lighten. In the morning, I found more prints, this time behind the cabin near the back window. They were deep and clear, moving toward the house and then away. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me. I packed up that afternoon. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I loaded my bags in the car and tried to start it. The engine clicked but didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. I don't know much about cars, but even I could see the problem. The battery cables had been cut. Cleanly, not chewed by animals. Cut. I stepped back and looked around. My heart was hammering. There was no cell service. I tried walking down the road for a signal, but it was useless. I came back before dark and locked myself inside. I blocked the door with the couch and jammed a chair under the handle for the back door. Then I waited. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the porch. They stopped by the front door. Then nothing. I sat there for over an hour, not moving, gripping the fire poker so tight my hand cramped. I must have fallen asleep at some point. When I woke up, it was dawn. I checked outside. No one there, but more prints. This time, they circled the cabin. I didn't eat that day. I stayed inside, listening. I thought about making a run for it, but I didn't know if someone was out there waiting. The nearest road was miles away. That night, they came back. 2 sets of steps this time. They didn't knock, just walked around slowly. I could hear them near the windows. I kept all the lights off. I pressed myself into a corner with the poker and a kitchen knife I had found. Hours passed, then silence. The next morning, I made a decision. I left everything behind, grabbed a backpack with water, a flashlight, and the knife and started walking. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't look back. I just walked until my legs felt like rubber. Around midday, I reached a ranger station. It was empty, but there was a radio. I called for help. A park ranger showed up an hour later. I told him someone was messing with me up at the cabin. He didn't seem surprised. He looked at me for a long time and then said there had been reports over the years. Break-ins, missing people. Nothing the police could prove. Just stories. We went back up together. My car was gone. The cabin had been broken into. Everything inside was destroyed. Torn cushions, broken dishes, even the walls scratched up. The ranger said it looked like animals, but I knew better. I asked him if anyone had been caught. He said no. I never went back. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. I moved back to the city and started over. But even now, I still wake up some nights thinking I hear footsteps. Slow, quiet, getting closer. I keep my doors locked and the curtains drawn. I don't go camping anymore. I don't go anywhere without cell service. And I always check the tread on any footprints I see. I learned something in those woods. When someone wants to find you, really find you, they will. And out there, no one hears you scream, because the only sound is the trees, and they don't care. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a week at a small cabin I found listed online. I'd been feeling burnt out. Work was draining me, and my apartment in the city had started to feel more like a box than a home. I just needed to get away from noise, people, and everything that had started to pile up in my head. The cabin was in northern Idaho, a few hours from any decent-sized town. It sat near the edge of a forest, backed by a stretch of thick woods that went on for miles. I didn't know anyone out there. That was part of the appeal. The drive up was long. I started early in the morning with a packed car. Enough groceries for a week, extra clothes, basic tools, and some old paperbacks I never had time to read. As I drove deeper into the woods, the signal on my phone dropped to 1 bar, then nothing. I didn't care. That was what I wanted. No messages, no emails, no calls. I arrived at the cabin around 4 p.m. It looked smaller in person, with dark wooden siding and a metal roof. The porch creaked under my boots. Inside was basic but clean. A small living area with a couch and an old fireplace, a kitchenette, 1 bedroom, and a tiny bathroom with just a toilet and sink. There was a water pump out back and a little shed next to the treeline. The air smelled like pine and earth. I could hear birds, wind moving through the trees, and nothing else. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, ate canned chili, and read for a while before heading to bed. It was cold, but I had thick blankets and a heavy sleeping bag. I slept through the night without waking up once. The next day, I hiked a little into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I stayed close enough to the cabin that I could always hear the windmill creaking on the roof when the wind picked up. I found an old animal trail that led deeper in, saw some tracks, and even spotted a few deer at a distance. That night, I cooked some pasta and sat out on the porch with a flashlight, watching the woods. Nothing felt off. Not yet. By the third night, something changed. I was lying in bed around midnight when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I've heard coyotes and raccoons, and this wasn't that. It was heavy, like boots crunching down on dried leaves. Slow, 1 step at a time. Then it stopped. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed still for a while, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Eventually, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a branch fell or a deer wandered close. I rolled over and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. About 10 feet from the porch, there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, just scuffed areas like someone had dragged their boots across the ground. I didn't see them the day before. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Felt quiet. Too quiet. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel like walking into the woods. I chopped some firewood from the pile stacked against the side of the cabin, cleaned the fireplace, and organized my gear. I kept checking the treeline. Night came fast. It always did out there. I lit a fire early, locked the doors, and made sure the windows were shut tight. I kept my flashlight next to me and a small hatchet under the couch. I don't know why. I didn't think I'd need it, but it made me feel better. Around 1 a.m., I heard the steps again. This time they came from the side of the cabin, not the front. Same sound. Slow, deliberate, then silence. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I found more scuffed dirt. This time, behind the shed near the woods. It looked like someone had stood there for a while. The ground was disturbed, the leaves pushed aside. I circled the cabin twice. I didn't see anyone. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to run. I had 5 days left. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe a local messing around. That evening, I stacked some rocks around the scuffed area. I figured if they were moved, I'd know someone came back. I sat inside with the fire burning low, flashlight and hatchet within reach. I didn't hear anything that night. No steps, nothing. But in the morning, the rocks were scattered. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone. No signal. I thought about driving into town, but it was almost 2 hours away. I didn't want to leave all my stuff behind. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe animals moved the rocks. But that afternoon, I found something near the tree line. A small pile of sticks, stacked in a strange way, almost like a symbol, not something random. I kicked it over and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I felt like I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Snaps, thuds, not loud, just enough to keep me from resting. The next morning, I found the shed door open. I know I had locked it. Inside, my tools were moved around. My axe was on the floor. A rope that had been hanging from a nail was lying across the threshold like someone had tripped over it. That was enough for me. I packed everything into the car and left most of the food behind. I wanted to be out before dark. The drive back was quiet. My phone picked up signal an hour down the road. I had a few missed calls, nothing urgent. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just went home, unpacked, and went back to work a few days later. I didn't sleep well for weeks. About 2 months later, I got a call from the owner of the cabin. They found the place broken into. The back window was smashed. A few items were taken. Nothing major. They asked if I saw anything while I was there. I told them no. I didn't want to explain what I felt, what I saw. I just said it was peaceful and quiet. But I knew someone was out there. Whoever it was, they waited until the third night to start making noise. They circled the cabin, watched me. Maybe they wanted to scare me. Maybe they were waiting for me to leave. I still think about the scuffed ground, the pile of sticks, the shed door. It was like someone was playing a slow game, seeing how close they could get without me catching them. That trip was supposed to help me relax, clear my head. Instead, it made me realize how alone we can really be out there. How easy it is for someone to hide in the woods just out of sight and watch. I haven't gone back to a cabin since. I stay in hotels now, somewhere with locks, cameras, and people nearby. And whenever I hear something outside at night, even in the city, I still get up and check the windows, just in case.